Ithaca was a poor island. Its soil lay thin over rock, and the hillsides carried goats better than grain, and the harbors were deep and sheltered enough to make a seafaring people out of the families who farmed there. On the highest ground above one of those harbors stood the house of the king. It had no marble and no gilded gates. It was a sprawling structure of stone and timber, with storerooms of wine and oil along its flanks, a great hall with a hearth burning in the middle of the floor, and a walled courtyard where the dogs slept in whatever sun they could find. The king of that house had not been seen for 20 years. He had sailed east with 12 ships and about 600 men when his son was still at the breast, to fight in a war at a city called Troy. That war ended in a Greek victory after 10 years, and the other kings came back to their own countries. Nestor returned to sandy Pylos and grew old telling the story. Menelaus reached Sparta again with Helen. Agamemnon, the high king, also reached his own door, though what met him there belongs further on. From Odysseus there was nothing. No ship came in, no message arrived, no body washed up on any beach where an Ithacan could hear of it. In the Greek world of that age, an absent king was not a temporary inconvenience. There was no written law of succession, and no council of regents standing by. There was property, and there were strong men who wanted the property, and there was very little between the two. So the young nobles of Ithaca and the islands around it came up to the palace and stayed. There were 108 of them. Each one wanted to marry the queen, because the man who married Penelope would take the house, the herds, the stored bronze, and in all likelihood the kingship with her. While they waited, they ate. The suitors killed the king's pigs and cattle every day, drew down his wine, and lounged in his hall throwing dice and shouting for servants. They had been doing it for years. No single evening broke any rule of hospitality, which was the whole design of the thing. The Greeks called the custom xenia, guest friendship, and it obliged a household to feed and shelter anyone who came to the door. The suitors had turned the obligation into a siege engine. They arrived as guests, and then they did not leave, and the estate bled out a few oxen at a time. 2 people held the line inside that house. The first was Penelope. She had no soldiers, no husband she could prove was alive, and no legal power to throw 100 armed young men out of her own hall. What she had was a loom and a great deal of patience. She announced that she would choose a new husband as soon as she had finished weaving a burial shroud for her father-in-law, Laertes, who was old and would need one. Nobody could reasonably object to that. A shroud for the head of the family was a duty, and the weaving of it was women's work of the most respectable kind. The loom in a house of that period stood upright, taller than the woman working it. The warp threads hung down from a beam and were held taut by rows of clay weights near the floor. The weaver worked standing, passing the weft across by hand, then beating each pass upward with a comb, so the cloth grew from the top down. Undoing the work meant lifting the beaten threads back out one at a time and letting them fall loose among the weights. Penelope wove every day where her women and the suitors could see her. Every night she brought torches into the room and picked the day's work out again, thread by thread, and the shroud never got any longer. 3 years passed in this way. The suitors watched the cloth and saw no reason to force the issue, since the answer had been promised and the answer was coming. What finally exposed the trick was not their patience running out, but a servant girl who slept with one of them and told him what happened in that room after dark. The suitors came in at night and caught the queen with the torches lit and the weft in her hands. The second person holding the line was Telemachus. He had been an infant when his father sailed, and he was about 20 now, which meant he had never seen his father's face. He had grown up in a house full of men who mocked him at their leisure and ate his inheritance in front of him, and who were careful never to give him a grievance sharp enough to take before the assembly. He was old enough to be angry. He was not old enough, and not nearly numerous enough, to do anything with the anger. Far to the west, further than any Ithacan had ever sailed, the missing king was sitting on a beach. The island was called Ogygia, and it belonged to a goddess named Calypso, who had found him half drowned in the surf 7 years earlier, and had kept him since. She had offered to make him deathless and ageless if he would stay. He had refused, and went on refusing, and spent his days on the headland, looking east across water no ship crossed. He did not know whether his wife had remarried. He did not know that his mother had died. He did not know that his father had left the palace for a farm in the hills and slept in the ashes by the fire like a servant. The Odyssey was composed somewhere around the 8th century BC and attributed to a poet named Homer. That places it about 700 years before Julius Caesar. The world the poem describes was already ancient when the poem was made. The Trojan War and its aftermath belonged to the Greek Bronze Age, 4 or 5 centuries before Homer, and that civilization had collapsed long before he was born. Its palaces had burned. Its writing system had been lost so completely that the Greeks of Homer's day had no memory of ever having had one. For a long time after its composition, the poem was not written down at all. It lived in the trained memories of professional singers who could hold tens of thousands of lines and who adjusted and polished as they performed. The Odyssey runs to roughly 12,000 lines. Sung aloud at a natural pace, it takes about 20 hours, which meant the original audience received it in pieces across many evenings, from one voice, in a hall lit by fire. Nobody knows who Homer was. The Greeks argued about whether he was one man or a name applied to many, and about whether he was blind, which a persistent tradition insisted. 7 cities claimed to be his birthplace. Being the hometown of Homer was worth money to a city even 25 centuries ago. The king of Sparta before the war was Tyndareus, and his daughter Helen was said to be the most beautiful woman alive. This was not treated in Sparta as good fortune. Every unmarried king and prince in Greece wanted her, and they came to Tyndareus in a crowd, armed, proud, and extremely alert to insult. Whichever man Tyndareus chose, the rest would be publicly rejected, in company, with their retainers standing behind them. A wedding of that size, held under those conditions, was one careless word away from a battle in the courtyard. Among the crowd was a young king from the Western Islands, who was not rich and not remarkable to look at, but who already had a reputation for cleverness. Odysseus made 2 calculations. He would not outbid the wealthy men for Helen, and there was nevertheless something here worth having. He went to Tyndareus privately and offered to solve the whole dangerous problem in exchange for a favor. The solution was procedural. Before any choice was announced, every suitor would swear an oath before the gods, binding him to accept whichever man was selected. The oath went further than acceptance. Each man swore that if anyone ever violated that marriage, he would come armed to defend it. Every suitor swore, because every suitor expected to be the one chosen. Tyndareus then named Menelaus, of the powerful house of Atreus, and nobody in the hall could object, because objection had been sworn away in advance. The favor Odysseus asked in return was help in marrying a different woman. Penelope was a niece of Tyndareus, clever and steady, and Odysseus wanted her. He got her, and took her home across the water to Ithaca, and in time they had a son. The marriage was, by every account that survives, a good one, which in Greek legend is close to unique. What Odysseus had also done was leave a loaded weapon lying on the table of Greek politics. The oath bound dozens of kings to make war on behalf of one marriage. It required only that somebody violate the marriage. The apple, the visit, and the summons. Troy was a real city. Its ruins stand on a low hill in northwestern Turkey called Hisarlik, above the strait that joins the Aegean to the Black Sea. In the late Bronze Age, it was fortified and rich, well placed to tax and provision the traffic moving between two seas, and its walls were built in massive sloping courses of cut stone that archaeologists have since dug out of the ground. To the Greeks, it was a wealthy, slightly foreign kingdom at the edge of their world. The legend put the origin of the trouble at a wedding on Mount Olympus, where the goddess of discord threw a golden apple among the guests, inscribed for the fairest. 3 goddesses claimed it. Hera was queen of the gods, Athena was goddess of wisdom and of war, and Aphrodite was goddess of love. Zeus declined to judge between his wife, his daughter, and Aphrodite, and handed the decision to a mortal. The mortal was a Trojan prince named Paris, who was minding cattle on a mountainside at the time. Each goddess offered Paris a bribe, which was understood by everyone concerned to be the normal procedure. Hera offered him power over all of Asia. Athena offered him wisdom and victory in every battle he ever fought. Aphrodite offered him the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris was young. He took the woman. The woman was married. Aphrodite did not regard this as an obstacle. When Paris came to Sparta on a diplomatic visit, Menelaus received him with full honors, feasted him, and then sailed off to a funeral in Crete, leaving his guest in the house with his wife. Menelaus came back to find Helen gone to Troy with Paris, along with a substantial share of the palace treasury. Whether she went willingly or was carried off was disputed among the Greeks themselves for 1,000 years, and the ancient sources preserve both versions. Either way, the oath came due. Menelaus went to his brother Agamemnon at Mycenae, who was the most powerful ruler in Greece, and Agamemnon sent out the call. Every man who had sworn at Sparta was now bound to sail. The ox, the donkey, and the furrow of salt. Odysseus did not want to go. He was not a coward, and the reasons were arithmetic. Troy was far off, its walls were famous, and a siege of a place like that promised to be long. He had a young wife, an infant son, and a kingdom that produced barely enough to run itself. A prophecy was said to have warned him that if he sailed for Troy, he would not come back for 20 years, and would come back alone, and would not be recognized when he did. So when the recruiters landed on Ithaca, led by a sharp-minded noble named Palamedes, Odysseus tried the one escape available to a man bound by a sacred oath. A madman cannot be held to an oath, and a madman is no use in a battle line. He arranged to be found insane. They found the king of Ithaca plowing a field, and plowing it wrong in every particular. He had yoked an ox together with a donkey, 2 animals of different height, weight, and pace, so that the beam dragged crooked and the furrow wandered. He was sowing the furrows with salt instead of seed. He looked through his visitors as though the field were empty. It was a careful performance, assembled out of details a farming people would recognize instantly as the work of a mind that had come apart. Palamedes did not believe any of it. He took the baby Telemachus from the nurse, walked out into the field, and laid the child on the ground in the path of the plow. Odysseus swerved. That was the end of the performance. A man who could see well enough to save his son could see well enough to sail. Odysseus never forgave Palamedes, and years later, in the camp below Troy, he took a slow and careful revenge, forging evidence that marked Palamedes as a traitor and getting him stoned to death by his own army. The Odyssey does not mention the episode. It sits in the other traditions about Odysseus like a stone in a shoe, and it shows the second edge of the same blade that saved him so often. Once caught, Odysseus threw himself into the war, as a man does when the shortest way home runs through it. He became the expedition's chief recruiter and fixer. His most famous catch was a boy hidden on the island of Skyros, dressed among the daughters of the local king, because the boy's goddess mother knew he was fated to die at Troy. The boy was Achilles, prophesied to be the greatest fighter of his generation. Odysseus went to Skyros as a peddler and laid out his stock in front of the king's daughters. There was fine cloth, and there was jewelry, and lying among the cloth and the jewelry there was a spear and a shield. Then, by arrangement, a war trumpet sounded outside. The girls scattered. One of them picked up the spear and the shield and turned to face the door. The fleet gathered at the port of Aulis, and it was the largest force the Greek world had ever put together, drawn from every kingdom in it. The poets counted more than 1,000 ships. Odysseus commanded 12 of them, from Ithaca and the small islands around it, which, beside the 100 ships of Agamemnon, was a modest squadron. He had not been summoned for his numbers. Then the wind failed. The fleet lay in harbor with the sails hanging, day after day, eating its stores while the men grew quarrelsome. A priest told Agamemnon that he had offended Artemis and that the goddess wanted a price. The price was his daughter. Iphigenia was brought to the camp on the promise of a wedding, and Agamemnon paid it, and the wind came up out of the north. The fleet sailed. Behind it, in Mycenae, Agamemnon's wife began a long and extremely patient hatred that would finish what the Trojans could not. 10 years under the walls. The Greeks beached their ships on the shore below Troy, built a fortified camp at the waterline, and prepared for a short campaign. The obstacle was the wall. Troy's fortifications were the best in that corner of the world, high courses of dressed stone sloping outward at the base, topped with brick and anchored by towers, and famous enough that legend claimed gods had helped raise them. The Greeks of that age had no siege towers, no catapults, and no engineering tradition for cracking a fortress on that scale. They had infantry, chariots, and time. What developed was not a siege in the later sense. The Greeks could not seal the city off because Troy had allies across Anatolia and roads that stayed open, and the Trojans could not push the invaders back into the water. The fighting rolled back and forth across the plain between the wall and the ships. Greek squadrons went out raiding the towns along the coast for grain, cattle, treasure, and captives, which was how the army fed itself for 10 years. Different men mattered in different ways in that long grind. Achilles was the spearhead and the terror of the field, worth a regiment on his own. Great Ajax was the wall, an enormous man behind an enormous shield, who never broke and never gave ground. Agamemnon held the command by weight of ships and gold. Nestor, old already, supplied the memory of earlier wars and the seasoned advice. Odysseus became the mind of the army. When the Greeks needed a negotiator, they sent Odysseus. Before the fighting began, he went into Troy itself with Menelaus under diplomatic protection and stood before the Trojan assembly to demand Helen's return. Trojans who were in that room remembered the performance decades later. He did not look impressive at first, they said. He stood stiffly with his eyes down, holding the speaker's staff as though he had never handled one, and a man might have taken him for sullen and awkward. Then he began, and the words came down like snow in a winter storm, and no man alive could stand against him. Troy refused the demand. There were Trojans who wanted Helen handed back before the ships came, and the court around old King Priam chose the war instead. When the army's morale finally broke, Odysseus repaired it personally. In the 9th year, Agamemnon decided to test his exhausted troops by proposing they give up and sail home, expecting a roar of refusal. The men cheered him and ran for the ships. The whole 10-year enterprise came within minutes of dissolving on the beach. Odysseus went through the mob, took the royal staff, shamed the officers by name, struck the loudest agitator in front of everyone, and drove the army back to its assembly ground, where he talked them into staying in their own war. No weapon did as much work that day. When quarrels broke out at the top, Odysseus was sent to settle them. The worst of those quarrels came late, when Agamemnon insulted Achilles over a captive woman named Briseis, and Achilles withdrew himself and his men from the fighting. He sat in his hut while Trojan attacks reached the ships and set them alight. Agamemnon, humbled, put together an enormous offer of gifts and chose Odysseus to carry it. Odysseus laid out the whole case with every skill he had. Achilles refused him. It is one of the few recorded occasions on which Odysseus lost an argument he had prepared for. The dirty work also went to Odysseus. On one black night he went out beyond the camp with the warrior Diomedes to scout the Trojan lines. They caught a Trojan spy named Dolon coming the other way, promised him his life in exchange for what he knew, emptied him of every detail, and then killed him. They used what he had told them to find the camp of a newly arrived Trojan ally, the Thracian king Rhesus, and they killed Rhesus and 12 of his men in their sleep and drove off his horses. On another occasion, Odysseus had himself whipped and bloodied and went into Troy dressed as a beggar to gather intelligence in the streets. Helen recognized him there and, tired of Troy by then, kept the secret. Later, he and Diomedes went in a last time and carried off the Palladium, the sacred image of Athena on which, according to prophecy, the safety of the city depended. None of this was glorious in the way Achilles was glorious. Homeric warfare had a code, and night raids, interrogations, disguises, and theft all sat at its outer edge. The Greeks felt the tension themselves. Later centuries argued about Odysseus without ever settling it, some celebrating the resourceful man who kept everyone alive, others condemning the liar. He is the rare legendary figure who is both the most admired and the most distrusted man in his own story. Hector, the eldest son of Priam and the defender of the city, fell to Achilles in single combat below the walls. Achilles, out of his mind with grief for his dearest friend Patroclus, tied the body behind his chariot and dragged it in the dust. Old Priam crossed the plain alone at night, went into the hut of the man who had killed his son, and knelt and kissed his hands and asked for the corpse. Achilles gave it back. The truce for that funeral is where the Iliad ends. The war did not end there. Achilles died soon after, as the prophecy had always said he would, shot down by an arrow from Paris that the poet said Apollo guided. It struck the one place on his body that could be hurt, the heel that has carried his name into every language since. The greatest fighter of the age burned on a pyre on a foreign beach. His death set off one last quarrel, and it was poisonous. The armor of Achilles had been made by the smith god Hephaestus, and it had to go to somebody. 2 men claimed it. Great Ajax was the strongest man left in the army, and had carried the body out of the fighting on his shoulders. Odysseus had held off the Trojans while he did it. The army judged the case, and some versions say Trojan prisoners were used as jurors to keep it honest, and the armor went to Odysseus. Ajax could not bear the verdict. That night, his mind gave way. Athena clouded his sight, and he went out and fell on the army's herds in the dark, killing sheep and cattle by the hundred, convinced that he was cutting down Agamemnon and the commanders, and Odysseus among them. Dawn showed him the carcasses. He planted his sword upright in the ground and fell on it. The Greeks lost their second best fighter to their own prize-giving, and Odysseus afterwards argued against Agamemnon that Ajax deserved an honorable burial. He had wanted the armor. He had not wanted this. By the 10th year, the Greek army was winning in every way that made no difference. Hector was dead. Paris was eventually killed as well. The city was battered, hungry, and stripped of allies. But the walls stood, and the gates held, and no Greek had yet set foot inside them. Prophecies were collected and worked through like items on a list. Fetch the bow of Heracles from the island where it lay. Bring the son of Achilles into the war. Steal the Palladium out of the temple. Odysseus arranged all of it, and the city still stood. The plan, when Odysseus put it to the other commanders, involved carpentry. The Greeks would stop attacking. They would appear to give up, and they would leave a gift behind on the shore. Under the direction of a craftsman named Odysseus, and with Athena's guidance, the army built an enormous hollow horse out of planks. It stood as tall as a siege tower, and was finished and polished like an offering meant for a temple. Inside the belly was a compartment with a hatch and a ladder, big enough for a picked force of armed men. The number varies between tellings, from a couple of dozen up to 50 and more, and every version agrees on who commanded them. Odysseus sat inside his own idea in the dark, with the best men left in Greece packed around him. Then the army did the difficult part, and disappeared. The Greeks burned their camp, hauled their ships down the beach into the water, and sailed away in full view of the walls, leaving the horse standing alone on the empty shore. The fleet did not go home. It went as far as the island of Tenedos, just over the horizon, and anchored there, and waited. One man stayed behind on purpose. Shinon volunteered for the job of being captured, which may be the least celebrated assignment of the entire war. He was found hiding in the marshes and dragged in front of the Trojans, and there he told them the story of his life. The Greeks had given up and sailed for home. They had left the horse as an offering to Athena to make amends for the theft of the Palladium. They had built it deliberately enormous so that the Trojans could never get it through their own gate, because a prophecy held that if the horse ever stood inside Troy, the city could not be taken. And the Greeks had meant to cut Sinon's throat as a sacrifice for a fair wind home, so that he had run for his life, and now hated his own people. Every element was engineered to make the Trojans want the horse, rather than merely tolerate it. The lie did not push, it pulled. Not everyone was persuaded. A Trojan priest named Laocoon warned the assembly against the gift, saying he feared Greeks even when they came bearing presents, and threw a spear into the horse's flank, where it stood quivering in the planks. The men inside held their breath. Then, in front of the whole city, 2 enormous serpents came in out of the sea and crushed Laocoon and his sons to death on the shore. The Trojans read that as a judgment on a man who had insulted a sacred offering. The princess Cassandra, whom Apollo had cursed to speak the truth and never be believed, cried out that the thing was full of armed men, and the city laughed at her, as the city always did. Then the Trojans took down a section of their own wall to get the horse inside, hauled it up to the citadel on rollers, hung it with flowers, and held the largest party in the history of the place. 10 years of siege were over. They drank the way people drink when a war ends. By the small hours, the city was asleep, with no watch on the walls worth the name. There had been one last test of nerve inside the horse before that. Helen had come down to it in the evening and walked round it, calling up to the hidden men in the voices of their wives, one after another, which she was able to imitate. Whether that was suspicion or mischief or some divided loyalty of her own, nobody could say afterwards. One of the warriors, hearing his own wife's voice for the first time in 10 years, started to answer. Odysseus put a hand over the man's mouth and held it there until Helen gave up and walked away. Deep in the night, Sinon slipped out and lit a signal fire on the shore. The fleet at Tenedos saw it and came back. Inside the citadel, the hatch opened in the belly of the horse, and Odysseus and his men came down the ladder into the sleeping heart of Troy. They killed the few sentries who were awake, opened the gates, and let the army in. The night the city burned. What followed was not a battle, and the ancient tellings do not soften it. The Trojans woke to fire, to screaming, and to armed men already inside the streets. Some of them fought back, half-armed in doorways and courtyards, magnificently and pointlessly. Priam's palace became a killing floor. The old king put on armor his body could no longer carry, and his wife Hecuba pulled him away from it and back to the household altar, which was the most protected ground in his world. Neoptolemus, the teenage son of Achilles, killed Priam at that altar. The poets kept a list of what happened that night, and they wrote it out like charges in an indictment. Cassandra ran to the temple of Athena and took hold of the statue of the goddess, and a Greek commander called Ajax the Lesser, a different man from the Ajax who had died on his own sword, tore her away from it and raped her in the sanctuary. Hector's small son Astyanax was thrown from the wall, killed as a child so that he could never grow into an avenger. The women of the royal house were divided among the victors as property. Andromache, Hector's widow, went to the son of the man who had killed her husband. Hecuba, the old queen, went to Odysseus. Helen was handed back to Menelaus, who had sworn to kill her the moment he saw her, and found, standing in front of her, that he could not. Greek religion was not a religion of mercy, but it was a religion of limits, and the limits were specific. Altars were sacred ground. Temples were sacred ground. A suppliant who put himself under a god's protection could not be touched. On the night Troy fell, the victors broke all of it, and Athena, who had backed the Greek army through the whole war and had helped design the horse, turned against them before morning. The immediate cause was Cassandra, dragged out of her temple by Ajax the Lesser, and the army's refusal afterwards to punish him for it. Her anger settled on the fleet as a whole. The homecomings became a second catastrophe. The Greeks quarreled before they had even launched, and the fleet split. Storms scattered the squadrons across the eastern Mediterranean. Ajax the Lesser was wrecked, dragged himself out onto a rock, shouted that he had survived in spite of the gods, and was knocked back into the sea by Poseidon for saying it. Menelaus was blown south to Egypt and wandered for 7 years before he saw Sparta again. Agamemnon reached home quickly, which was the worst luck any of them had. Clytemnestra had spent 10 years remembering the daughter he killed at Aulis. She met him with a welcome, and a bath, and a knife. The High King of the Greeks was butchered in his own house on the day he came back to it. Odysseus put to sea from the ruins with 12 ships and something like 600 men, expecting to be home in a few weeks. Ismarus, and the beach where they stayed to drink. 12 ships stood off the Trojan shore in early summer light, riding low with plunder. Each was a black-hulled galley of the Bronze Age type, about 50 men to a hull, one mast carrying a single square sail, and benches of rowers for when the wind failed. There were no decks to sleep under, and no cabins. There was no compass, and no chart. Sailors of that period navigated by coastlines, headlands, star positions, and the accumulated memory of men who had made the passage before, and they beached the ships at night whenever the shore allowed it, because open water after dark was for fools. The route home was known to every man aboard. Southwest along the coast of Asia Minor, then island hopping across the Aegean, then round the southern capes of Greece and north up the western side to Ithaca. It came to something like 560 miles, a few weeks of ordinary sailing. Some of the men had left home as teenagers and were in their 30s now, with sons at home who were nearly grown. They threw it away at the first opportunity. The coast of Thrace lay close to the route, and on it stood the city of Ismarus, home of the Cicones, who had been allies of Troy. To a war fleet of that age, an enemy town with its fighting men dead at Troy was not an obstacle. It was a target. Raiding was not shameful in that world. It was one of the standard ways a king grew rich, and after 10 years of war, it had become a reflex. Odysseus gave the order, and the fleet went in. The raid succeeded the way such raids succeeded. The town was sacked, the men killed, the women and the treasure divided among the crews. Odysseus, telling the story years afterwards, was entirely matter-of-fact about all of it. Then he read the situation and ordered an immediate withdrawal to the ships. The crews refused. There was wine on that beach in quantity, and slaughtered sheep and cattle, and after a decade of army rations, the men were going to have their feast. They ate and drank through the afternoon and into the night. While they did, survivors from Ismarus went inland to their kinsmen among the Cicones of the interior, who were numerous, warlike, and good with chariots. The counterattack came at dawn. Homer compares the numbers to leaves in spring. The Greeks, heavy with wine and mutton, had to form a line on open sand against fresh troops who had slept. They held through the morning. In the afternoon the line broke, and the crews scrambled back into the water and hauled off the beach with spears dropping around them. When they were clear, they counted. 6 men were missing from every ship, which came to about 72 dead, traded for a pile of loot and one night's drinking. Before setting course, the survivors called the name of each dead man 3 times across the water, so that no ghost would be left behind unmourned. The fleet ran southwest with a following wind, and made for the southern tip of Greece. It passed the island of Cythera and came up to the last obstacle on the route home, Cape Malea, the southeastern fingertip of the Greek mainland. Cape Malea is not a legend. It is a real headland with real mountains behind it, and it has been feared by working sailors for as long as there have been ships. The high ground funnels and twists the wind so that it arrives from unexpected quarters and changes without warning. The currents around the point run hard. Weather coming down from the north can push a vessel away from the land faster than oars can pull it back. Greeks had a proverb about the place, which advised the sailor who rounded Malea to forget about going home. Ships wrecked there by the hundred in the age of sail, and the seabed around the cape is littered with cargoes spanning thousands of years. The 12 ships came up to Malea, turned the corner, and were within about a week of Ithaca. Then the north wind came down on them. The storm caught the fleet at the worst possible place and drove it bodily away from the cape, south past Cythera and out into open water. For 2 days and 2 nights, the ships ran before it with the sails torn, unable to work back. On the 3rd day, the sky cleared, and the crews raised what canvas they had and tried to beat north again, and the wind and the current would not allow it. For 9 days after that, Odysseus said, the winds carried them across the fish-filled sea, away from every coast that any man aboard had ever seen or been told about. Those 9 days are the poem's way of drawing a line on the map and then erasing the map. Everything before Malea is geography that can be visited. Troy, Ismarus, Cythera, and the Cape itself are all real places on a real coast. Everything after it belongs to a different kind of space, a sea of islands that appear on no chart, occupied by beings who follow no human rules. Ancient readers argued about it anyway, pinning the Lotus Eaters to Libya and the Cyclopes to Sicily. The geographer Eratosthenes, who was a sensible man, said that the route of Odysseus would be found on the day somebody found the cobbler who stitched the bag of the winds. For the men on the benches, it was not a literary transition. Bronze Age sailors lived by known coasts the way later people live by roads, and they were now past all of them, steering on guesswork with the water in the skins going flat, and no way to know what shore would come up ahead. 10 years of war had at least been 10 years in a known place. The 3 men who ate the fruit. On the 10th day, a low green coastline came up over the horizon. The ships ran in, found fresh water, and the crews ate on the beach whatever they had left. It looked like a mild country. No walls, no chariots, no glint of spear points on the hills. Odysseus did not put the whole force ashore. He picked 2 sailors and a herald, 3 men, and sent them inland with the simplest instructions available. Find out who lives here, and find out whether they eat bread. Bread was the Greek test for whether the inhabitants of an unknown country were civilized human beings, since bread means grain, and grain means plowing, sowing, harvest, storage, and a settled community with laws. The three men walked into the green interior and did not come back. The people of that coast were called the Lotus Eaters, and by any outward measure they were the kindest hosts Odysseus met anywhere on the voyage. They did not attack the scouts, they did not rob them, or hold them, or enslave them. They welcomed the strangers, sat them down, and shared their food, which is exactly what the law of hospitality required of them. The food was the fruit of the lotus, a sweet flowering plant that was the whole of their diet. Whoever ate it stopped wanting to go home. That is the entire mechanism. The lotus did not poison the body and did not overpower the will. The three scouts stayed awake, healthy, and comfortable. They simply no longer cared about Ithaca. The wives and the children they had spent 10 years trying to get back to became a pleasant story about somebody else, and all they wanted was to stay where they were and eat lotus. Odysseus understood it immediately. He did not negotiate, and he did not send a second party in after the first, and he did not taste the fruit himself to assess it. He went in with a rescue party, took the three weeping men by force, dragged them back down to the water while they begged to be left, and tied them under the rowing benches. Then he ordered every other man aboard at once, before anybody else could be offered anything. The fleet pulled off that coast at speed with 3 of its sailors lashed down and sobbing. The episode runs to about 20 lines in Homer. There is no battle in it and no casualty. Whether a real plant lies behind the story is a question people have asked for a very long time, and the ancients went looking themselves. Herodotus, the traveler and historian, reported a people on the North African coast who lived on the sweet fruit of a real shrub and whom the Greeks called lotus eaters. That plant still grows there. It is a modest relative of the jujube, pleasant to eat and entirely harmless, which rather undersells the legend. Others proposed the blue water lily of the Nile, which has mild sedative properties, or the opium poppy, which was known and cultivated around the Bronze Age Mediterranean. The Greek word at the center of this poem is nostos, meaning the homecoming, the return of a man across the sea. Thousands of years later, a Swiss medical student put nostos together with algos, meaning pain, to name a condition he had observed in homesick soldiers, and called it nostalgia. The fleet stood out to sea and left that coast exactly as it had found it. Behind the ships, the green country sank into the haze, and on the benches the 3 rescued men wept themselves quiet, and then, as the hold of the fruit faded with the distance, came back to themselves and picked up their oars. The cave with the cheeses in it. The next landfall was a rugged coast of mountains and forest under a smoke-gray sky. Nothing was planted on it. There were no plowed strips, no ships drawn up, no walls, and no smoke from any town. From the water, the Greeks could see the mouths of caves in the hills, and folds and pens for flocks built up out of stones, and figures moving on the slopes that were much too large to be men. Offshore there was a smaller island, wooded and empty, full of wild goats that had never been hunted and did not run. The fleet anchored there and killed the goats and ate well, and that would have been the whole of the visit if Odysseus had not wanted to know who lived across the water. He announced in the morning that he would take his own ship, and only his own ship, over to the mainland to find out what manner of beings owned those caves, whether they feared the gods, and whether they gave gifts to guests. He picked 12 of his best men for the shore party and left the rest with the vessel. He also took a goatskin of wine, which is worth noticing because on a reconnaissance, it is an odd thing to carry. The wine had been given to him at Ismarus by a priest of Apollo, whose household he had spared during the raid. It was dark and sweet, and so strong that its owner mixed it 1 part wine to 20 parts water, which is roughly 4 times the dilution a Greek used at an ordinary dinner. Odysseus said afterwards that something in his mind had told him he was going to meet a savage stranger, huge and lawless, and so he brought it. They found the cave without difficulty, a large cavern in the cliffs near the shore, fenced round outside with a yard wall of quarried boulders and tall pines. The owner was out with his flocks. Inside, the Greeks found the home of an extremely orderly monster. The lambs and kids were penned separately and sorted by age, the youngest in one fold, the middling in another, the eldest in a third. Cheeses stood drying on racks, pails and bowls of milk and whey were set out, all clean, all managed. The crew wanted to take some cheese and drive off some lambs and get back to the ship before the owner returned. It was obviously the correct decision. Odysseus refused it. He wanted to see the man who lived there, and, as he admitted later, to find out whether he would give guest gifts. So the shore party lit a fire, helped themselves to the cheese, and sat down to wait. The host came home at evening, driving his flocks in front of him and carrying an enormous load of firewood, which he threw down with a crash that sent the Greeks scrambling into the dark at the back of the cave. Then he rolled a boulder across the entrance. Homer says that 22 wagons could not have shifted that stone. His name was Polyphemus. He was a cyclops, one of a race of one-eyed giants who planted nothing, built nothing, held no assemblies and made no laws, each family living apart in its own cave and answerable to nobody. He was also a son of Poseidon. He milked his ewes and goats in perfect order, curdled half the milk for cheese, and set the rest aside for his supper, and then built up his fire, and by the light of it, he saw the men. Odysseus stepped forward and made the correct speech. They were Greeks, homeward bound from Troy, driven off course, and they came to his knees as suppliants, hoping for hospitality or a guest gift, as the custom was. He reminded the giant that Zeus himself protected strangers and avenged wrongs done to guests. It was the speech that had worked on every civilized shore in the Greek world. Polyphemus answered that the Cyclopes cared nothing for Zeus or any of the gods, being stronger than they were, and then asked, in a conversational way, where the ship was moored. Odysseus said that the ship had been wrecked on the rocks, and that these men were the only survivors. Polyphemus made no reply to that. He lunged, took 2 of the sailors, one in each hand, dashed their heads against the floor, tore them apart, and ate them, bones and all, while their companions wept and raised their hands to a Zeus who did not answer. Then he drank a quantity of milk, stretched out among his sheep, and went to sleep. Odysseus had his sword at his side, and he considered crawling over and driving it into the giant's liver. He stopped himself with one piece of cold reasoning, which was the boulder. If Polyphemus died in his sleep, the door of the cave would stay shut forever, because the whole shore party together could not move that stone. Killing the jailer meant starving beside his body. The prison and the jailer had to be kept alive. Whatever escape existed had to leave Polyphemus able to open the door and unable to stop them going through it. Morning came and Polyphemus ate 2 more sailors for breakfast, then drove his flocks out to pasture and rolled the boulder back across the entrance behind him. Through that day, locked in, Odysseus built the plan. There was a great staff of green olive wood lying in the cave, as long and as thick as the mast of a merchant ship. Odysseus cut a fathom's length off it, about the span of a man's outstretched arms. His men shaved it smooth and sharpened one end to a point, and he turned the point in the embers until the green wood hardened, and then they hid the whole thing under the dung on the cave floor. Then they drew lots for the 4 men who would help drive it. The lots fell on the 4 he would have picked himself. Polyphemus came back at evening and ate 2 more men. 6 were gone now, of the 12. Then Odysseus filled a wooden bowl with the priest's undiluted wine and offered it to him politely, as a gift to go with the meal. The giant drank it and demanded more, and drank that, and demanded a third, and then, mellowing, offered his guest a gift in return and asked his name. Odysseus said that his name was Nobody. That was what his mother and his father called him, he said, and all his friends. Polyphemus, drunk and pleased with himself, announced the guest gift he had chosen. He would eat nobody last, after all his companions. Then he fell over backwards and passed out so deeply that the wine came back up while he slept. The Greeks pulled the stake out of the dung and held the point in the embers until the green wood glowed and was about to catch. 4 men lifted the beam. Odysseus guided the point into the giant's single eye and put his weight on it from above, spinning it the way a shipwright spins a drill with a strap, while the 4 leaned on the shaft below. The eye hissed round the burning wood the way hot iron hisses when a smith plunges it into cold water to temper it. Polyphemus woke screaming, tore the stake out, and bellowed for help. The other Cyclops came through the night from their own caves and gathered outside the sealed boulder and called in to ask what was wrong. Was somebody stealing his flocks? Was somebody killing him by treachery or by force? And the answer came from inside that nobody was killing him, nobody by treachery. His neighbors thought about that. If nobody was harming him, the trouble must come from Zeus, and sickness sent by Zeus was a private matter, and he should pray about it to his father Poseidon. Then they went back to bed. The blinded giant still held the door. He rolled the boulder aside himself and sat down in the entrance with his arms spread wide, feeling for anyone who tried to go out among the sheep. Odysseus worked in the dark at the back of the cave. He took the fat, woolly rams and lashed them together in threes, with willow withies pulled from the giant's own bed. Under the belly of each middle ram, he tied one of his men, with the flanking rams walking on either side to shield him. For himself, he took the biggest ram in the flock, got underneath it, and hung on to the fleece with both hands. At dawn, the rams pushed out to pasture as they did every morning. Polyphemus stroked the back of each animal as it passed him, and felt nothing but wool. His favorite came last, carrying Odysseus, and the giant stopped it and spoke to it gently, wondering aloud why the leader of the flock was walking slowly today, and whether it was grieving for its master's eye, and describing what he would do to nobody if nobody were ever caught. Then he led it through. Once they were beyond the wall and out of reach, the Greeks untied themselves, drove the fat rams down to the water in front of them, and rowed hard for the open sea, 6 men fewer than they had come. The ship pulled away from that shore with the oars going fast and the stolen rams bleeding in the hold. On the cliff top behind it, the blind giant felt his way along the rocks, following the sound of the rowing. Silence was the obvious course. Every stroke bought distance, and distance was safety, and the men at the oars understood that perfectly well. When the ship was about as far offshore as a shout will carry, Odysseus stood up and shouted. He told the Cyclops that if anyone ever asked how he lost his eye, he should say it was his own doing, for devouring guests in his own house, and that Zeus and the other gods had punished him for it. Polyphemus tore the top off a hill and threw it at the voice. The rock came down just ahead of the bow, and the wave it raised drove the ship backwards toward the beach, so that the crew had to row for their lives to get off the land again. The men asked their captain, in as many words, to stop talking to the giant. He did not stop. The ship clawed out to twice the distance, and Odysseus stood up again, and this time his own shipmates got hold of him and tried to talk him down and hold him down. It made no difference. He called across the water that if anyone asked who had blinded him, the Cyclops should say it was Odysseus, sacker of cities, son of Laertes, whose home was on Ithaca. Name, title, father, and address. To understand why a careful man handed over all 4, it helps to know what a name did in that world. The trick with nobody had saved 12 lives, and it carried a cost that only became visible afterward. As long as Polyphemus believed that nobody had beaten him, then in the accounting of reputation that Greek nobles lived inside, nobody had. The deed existed, and the credit did not. Men of that class lived and died for kleos, which meant the glory of having a name attached to a deed and carried down the generations in song. An anonymous triumph was worth nothing in that currency. Standing in the stern of that ship, Odysseus was choosing between safety and signature, and he chose the signature. What he did not know was that the shepherd he had blinded was a son of Poseidon, god of the sea and shaker of the earth, and one of the most powerful beings in the Greek order of things. A curse in Greek belief was not a general expression of ill will. It was a formal instrument, a petition addressed to a god, and like any petition, it had requirements. The petitioner had to establish standing, which Polyphemus did by naming his father. The petitioner had to name the offender precisely, because a god asked to punish the wrong man may punish the petitioner instead. A curse laid on an unnamed sailor somewhere at sea was unenforceable. A curse laid on Odysseus, son of Laertes, of Ithaca, was a document with a name, a patronymic, and a home port on it. Polyphemus lifted his hands to the sky and prayed. He asked Poseidon if he was truly the god's son to grant that Odysseus, sacker of cities, son of Laertes, whose home was on Ithaca, should never reach that home. And if it was fated that he must reach it, then let him come late and broken, after losing every one of his companions, in a ship belonging to strangers, and let him find trouble in his house when he arrived. That prayer is the plot of everything that follows, itemized in advance. Late, broken, every companion lost. A stranger's ship, trouble in the house, Poseidon granted all of it. Then Polyphemus threw a second hilltop, which missed the stern and washed the ship helpfully out to sea, and the giant passes out of the story. One detail from the cave carries forward. Odysseus had kept the great ram that carried him out, and back on the goat island, with the 12 ships together again, he sacrificed that ram to Zeus, burning the thigh bones and asking for a safe homecoming. Homer records flatly that Zeus paid no attention to the offering. The god of guests had watched 6 of his suppliants eaten alive in that cave. He had also watched the affair begin with uninvited men breaking into a stranger's home and eating his cheese. From that beach onward, the voyage had an adversary with a specific grievance, and the nature of the journey changed accordingly. Storms were no longer weather, currents were no longer chance. The sea itself, which was the road home, and the medium every mile of the journey had to cross, belonged to the enemy. Poseidon could not kill Odysseus because fate, which binds gods as well as men, had decreed a homecoming. Everything short of killing him was permitted. The 12 ships divided the sheep of Polyphemus fairly, feasted on the beach, and slept, and at dawn they stood out in formation and went on. The island of Aeolia floated. It was not anchored to the seabed, and it drifted on the surface of the water, and it was ringed all round by an unbroken wall of bronze rising above sheer cliffs. Its ruler was Aeolus, and Zeus had given him a particular office in the running of the world. He was keeper of the winds. Every gale, breeze, squall, and hurricane answered to this one cheerful administrator on his floating island. Aeolus lived there with his wife and their 12 children, 6 sons and 6 daughters, and he had solved the problem of finding suitable matches in a remote location by marrying the 6 sons to the 6 daughters. The whole family dined together every day in a house full of good things. Homer reports the arrangement without comment of any kind. Aeolus was also a proper host, the first the voyagers had met since Troy. He took Odysseus and all his crews in and entertained them for a full month, and every evening he asked for more of the story. Troy, the horse, the sack, the wandering, the giant in the cave. When the Greeks finally asked leave to go, Aeolus did something that no other host in the whole epic does. He solved their problem. He took the hide of an ox 9 years old and made a great bag out of it. Into that bag he put every wind on earth except one. The northerlies that had wrecked them at Malea went in, and the crosswinds, and the storms, the entire howling inventory. He tied the bag shut with a bright silver cord, and set the knot so that not a breath could work its way out. Then he stowed it in the hold of Odysseus's ship, and set the one remaining wind, a steady, gentle westerly, to blow the fleet home. It was less a gift than a guarantee. With every contrary wind on the planet shut in a leather sack in the bilge, nothing in the sky could stop them, and nothing did. For 9 days and 9 nights, the west wind carried the 12 ships east without incident, which was the longest run of good fortune in the entire 10 years. Odysseus by now trusted nobody with anything. He would not let another man touch the sheet that controlled the sail. He steered and worked the rope himself, day and night, without sleeping, for the whole 9 days. On the 10th day they raised Ithaca. It was not a smudge on the horizon either. They came in close enough to see the fires burning on the island, close enough to make out the figures tending them. 10 years of war and a year of wandering, and there was the actual coastline, the harbors the crews had grown up in, an hour or two of easy sailing away. Some of those fires were burning in their own houses. Odysseus, with the sheet still in his hand and the end in sight, felt 9 sleepless days arrive all at once. He decided the danger was over. He lay down on the deck and slept. What happened next happened in murmurs. There was the captain, asleep at last, and there in the hold was the bag he had guarded the whole way, the bag nobody was allowed to touch or ask about. The men talked, and Homer lets the talk be heard. Everywhere this man goes, they said, he is honored and loaded with gifts. He is carrying home plunder from Troy. And what are the rest of us carrying home, after the same miles and the same fighting? Nothing at all. Now Aeolus has given him that, and it will be silver and gold. Let us have a quick look and see how much is in it. They were not mutineers. They had rowed and bled through everything their captain had been through, and had genuinely nothing to show for it. And he had told them nothing about the bag. And secrecy from a man famous for cunning invites exactly one interpretation. They were tired, poor, and jealous, within sight of their own chimney smoke, taking an unauthorized look at the luggage. They untied the silver cord. Every wind on earth came out of the hold at once. The hurricane took all 12 ships and threw them away from Ithaca while the crews screamed. Odysseus woke into the sound of it, and into the sight of his own island being pulled away over the horizon by weather he had personally carried aboard. He weighed going over the side and letting the sea have him. He weighed drowning against enduring, and he chose, in his own flat phrase, to endure. And he covered his head with his cloak and lay still on the deck while the storm blew his life apart. The wind delivered the fleet back to Aeolia with terrible neatness, to the same bronze wall and the same beach they had left 10 days earlier. Odysseus went up to the house with one companion and a herald, found the family at dinner, and sat down on the threshold like a beggar. The astonishment in that hall was total. How could he be here? What power had done this to him? Odysseus told the truth, which for him was unusual enough that the poem notes it. "My wretched crew ruined me," he said, "and sleep. Set it right, my friends. You have the power." Aeolus stood up and ordered him out of the house. The words mattered more than the eviction. "Leave the island at once," he said, "most cursed of living men. It is against all law for me to help or shelter a man so plainly hated by the blessed gods." Aeolus was a professional in the weather business, and he had examined the facts. A guaranteed fair wind, 9 clear days, and a hurricane out of a sealed bag within sight of the destination. There was only one available diagnosis. This was not misfortune. Somewhere in heaven, somebody with jurisdiction had it in for this man, and no sensible household anywhere should touch him. Doors would close from here on, politely and permanently. The Greeks went back down to their ships and put out to sea with no wind at all to help them, because the master of the winds had washed his hands of them. For 6 days and 6 nights they rowed, eating their hearts out, in Homer's phrase, over what they had done to themselves. Nobody blamed anybody aloud. There was nothing left to say. The fires of Ithaca had been visible from the deck, and now there was water in every direction, and the sound of oars. On the seventh day, a coastline came up ahead, with high cliffs enclosing a harbor so sheltered and so still that it might have been built to order. 11 ships rode gratefully inside and tied up close together along the rock. Odysseus kept his own ship outside the harbor mouth and made it fast to a rock there instead. He never fully explained the decision. The place was called Telepolis, in the land of the Laestrygonians, and from a sailor's point of view it was perfect. Sheer cliffs wrapped it round on every side. 2 headlands nearly met at the entrance, so that no swell got in, and inside the water never rose. 11 exhausted crews looked at that flat surface after 6 days on the oars and did the natural thing. They moored close in and rested. Nobody appears to have asked why a harbor that good was empty. There were no ships in it, and no town beside it, only a thread of smoke rising somewhere inland. Odysseus asked. He tied up outside the entrance, climbed a crag to look over the country, saw nothing but the smoke, and did what he had done on every strange coast since the Lotus Eaters. He sent 3 men, 2 sailors and a herald, to find out who lived there and whether they ate bread. The scouts followed a wagon road inland and came to a spring outside the town, where a girl was drawing water. She was a strapping girl, the poem says, and she was the daughter of the local king, Antiphates. They asked her politely who ruled the country, and she pointed out her family's house, and the scouts walked to it. Inside, they found a woman the size of a mountain peak, who called at once for her husband. The king came home from the assembly and dealt with his foreign visitors directly. He picked up one of the sailors and started preparing him for dinner. The other 2 ran back down the wagon road, and behind them, Antiphates raised the alarm through the town, and the Laestrygonians came out of their houses in thousands. They were not men, they were giants. They did not chase the scouts, which would have been the ordinary response and would have cost them a chase. They went to the cliffs instead. The geometry of the harbor now worked entirely against the ships in it. 11 hulls were moored side by side on still water, in a basin ringed with high rock, with one narrow gate to the sea. The Laestrygonians spread out along the cliff tops all the way round the basin and began tearing loose boulders and dropping them straight down. There was no cover, there was no room to maneuver, and no wind to sail out on. Beneath the falling stones, there was nothing but wooden hulls and men. Homer compresses the massacre into a few lines. Ships splintering, men crying out, and then the giants wading into the shallows to spear the swimmers like fish and carry them off for their meal. Odysseus, outside the entrance, could hear all of it, and could do nothing about any of it. He drew his sword, cut the cable holding his own ship to the rock, shouted his crew onto the oars, and rowed for open water while the harbor behind him boiled. His was the only ship that got out, because it had been the only ship outside. 12 ships had left Troy. 11 of them, and every man aboard them, were destroyed in that basin in about an hour. That was perhaps 500 men, comrades of 10 years of war and a year of wandering, gone between one meal and the next. What remained of the fleet of Ithaca was 1 galley and something like 45 souls. The neighbors, the cousins, the boys who had grown into men on the beaches below Troy ended in a nameless fjord past the edge of the map. When the Ithacans in later years counted what Troy had cost them, most of the total was that hour. What saved the one ship was not strength, and not divine favor. It was a decision made on no evidence, by a man who had looked at a perfect harbor and declined it because a year of catastrophe had taught him that perfect things offered to tired men usually have a hook in them. The captain who fell asleep within sight of Ithaca did not sleep here, and the difference between those 2 men was 11 ships. The survivors ran on across empty water, and Homer gives them one sentence of rest that is also the saddest sentence in the book. They were glad to have escaped death, he says, and grieving for their companions. In time, the ship raised a low, wooded island, and the crew beached it. For 2 days and 2 nights, the survivors lay beside the hull and did nothing at all, eating their hearts out with exhaustion and sorrow. On the 3rd day, Odysseus took a spear and a sword and climbed to a lookout and saw smoke rising from a house deep in the forest. He thought about walking straight to it and decided instead to feed his men first. On the way back down, a huge stag crossed his path, coming to a stream to drink. He killed it, tied its feet, carried it back to the beach across his shoulders, and the crew ate meat and slept. At dawn, he called them together and told them the truth of their position, which was that he did not know their position. They did not know east from west here, he said, or where the sun set or where it rose. There was smoke inland, somebody had made it, and the only way forward was to find out who. The men broke down and wailed when they heard it, and Homer explains exactly why. They remembered the last 3 times somebody had gone to see who made the smoke. The lotus eaters, the cave, the harbor full of falling rock. In their experience, smoke on a horizon meant that some of them were about to be eaten. It was not cowardice. It was pattern recognition. Odysseus divided the survivors into 2 platoons of 22, one under himself and one under his second-in-command, a large, brave, somewhat unsteady kinsman named Eurylochus. They shook lots in a bronze helmet, and the lot that jumped out was the lot of Eurylochus. So Eurylochus and his 22 marched inland, weeping as they went, and the men left on the beach wept, watching them go. Deep in the forest they came to a clearing with a house of polished stone in it, and around the house prowled mountain wolves and lions. The animals did not attack. They rose on their hind legs and fawned on the visitors, wagging and cringing like dogs greeting a master coming back from dinner, which was worse than a charge would have been. From inside the house came a woman singing at a great loom. The men called out. The doors opened, and a gracious lady invited them in for food and rest, and the whole platoon went inside, except one. Eurylochus stayed in the trees and watched through the doorway. The lady was Circe, and she was not an ordinary woman. She was a goddess, minor by Olympian standards, but genuine, a daughter of Helios the sun, and an aunt of the notorious Medea. She lived alone in the forest with her loom, her tame predators, and her particular practice. She sat the 22 sailors down and served them a dish of cheese, barley meal, honey, and wine, and stirred into it a drug that made a man forget his own country. When they had eaten it, she struck them with a wand, and they became pigs. Bristles, snouts, bodies, voices, everything except the one thing that mattered, which was that their minds stayed human. She penned them in her sty and threw them acorns and cornel berries, and went back to her weaving. The wolves and lions in the yard, it was now obvious, had arrived the same way. Eurylochus ran back through the forest and could hardly get the words out. He begged Odysseus to launch the ship and leave the transformed men where they were, while escape was still possible, which was, in strictly actuarial terms, sound advice. Odysseus refused it. He put on his sword, took his bow, and told Eurylochus to lead him back to the house, and when Eurylochus clung to his knees and refused to go, he left him at the ship and went alone. There was no plan in his head, and the poem is honest about that. One man with a sword was walking up to a goddess who converted platoons into livestock, and his strategy amounted to being angry. On the forest path a young man appeared, and it was Hermes, sent, as it later emerged, at Athena's quiet prompting. Hermes told him plainly that he was walking to his own destruction, and then, being a practical god, handed him the remedy. He pulled a plant out of the ground, black at the root with a flower white as milk, hard for a mortal to dig, which the gods called moly. With moly in him, the drug would not work. Then Hermes scripted the rest of the evening. When her wand comes down and nothing happens, draw the sword and rush her as though to kill. She will offer her bed. Do not refuse a goddess, but make her first swear the great oath of the gods to plot no further harm, or she will strip you of your strength when you are unarmed. It went exactly to the script. Circe served the drugged cup, and Odysseus drank it. The wand came down, and he did not turn. He came at her with the sword out, and she ducked under it, caught his knees, and asked the question that has echoed oddly ever since. Who are you, that my drugs cannot touch you? You must be Odysseus, the man of many turns. Hermes always told me he would come here on his way home from Troy. The witch had his itinerary in advance. His arrival on her island had been, in some register kept above the mortal world, scheduled. She swore the oath he demanded. Her 4 maidservants bathed the salt off him and set out a meal, and Odysseus sat in front of the food and would not eat. Circe asked why. How could any decent man eat and drink, he said, before his companions were free? Turn them back and let me see them. She went out to the sty with her wand and drove the pigs into the yard, and anointed each one with a second drug, and the bristles fell away, and they were men again, and younger and taller than they had been. They knew Odysseus and wept, every one of them, and the goddess herself was moved by the sound of it. Then Circe invited the entire crew. Bring the ship ashore, she said, stow the gear in the caves, and bring the rest of your men up to the house. Odysseus went back for them, and all but talked Eurylochus round, who had reason to object, having seen the sty from the visitors' side. They stayed a year. They were not imprisoned, not enchanted, and, so far as the poem says, not drugged. They ate abundant meat, and drank sweet wine in the house of the goddess every day, and the days folded into seasons, and the seasons closed a full circle of the year, and nobody said the word Ithaca. The men who had wept within sight of their island's fires sat by warm hearths and ate well. It ended with the crew waking the captain. His men took him aside, and the tone of the words is careful, the way people speak to a sleepwalker. Strange man, they said, remember your own country now, if it is really fated that you should reach it. Odysseus went to Circe that evening, took her knees, and asked her to keep her promise and send him home. She did not argue and did not bargain, which distinguishes her from almost everyone else who ever entertained him. She told him instead that there was another voyage to make first. Before he could sail for Ithaca, he had to sail to the house of Hades and dread Persephone, to the land of the dead, and consult the ghost of the blind prophet Tiresias of Thebes, who alone among the dead had been permitted to keep his understanding, and who would tell him the way home. Odysseus said that his heart broke when he heard it. He sat down on the bed and wept, and wanted no more of life. No living man had ever made that voyage. When he could speak, he asked the practical question, which was who would pilot them, since no ship had ever sailed to Hades. Circe answered that no pilot was needed. Raise the mast, spread the sail, and sit still. The north wind would carry them there. She gave him precise instructions for the ritual, the trench, the offerings, the black ram, and the black ewe. In the morning, while the crew was mustering to leave, the company lost one more man in the least dignified way available. The youngest of them, a sailor named Elpenor, not much of a fighter and not overburdened with brains, had drunk heavily the night before and gone up to sleep on the flat roof of the house for the cool air. The noise of departure woke him suddenly. He forgot where he was, stepped off the roof instead of going down the ladder, and broke his neck. His shipmates, hurrying for the beach, did not stop to bury him. The ship stood out from Aiaia with a fair wind the goddess sent behind it, and the crew learned only at sea where that wind was taking them, and wept and tore their hair. The trench at the edge of the world. The ship ran all day before Circe's wind, and at sunset it came to the limit of the world, the deep-flowing river of ocean that the Greeks believed circled all lands. Beyond it lay the country of the Cimmerians, a people wrapped permanently in mist and cloud, on whom the sun never looks, and past their fog-bound coast was the entrance to the world below. Homer paints it gray on gray. No monster guards that border. The border is simply where the light stops. They beached the ship and carried the offerings to the place Circe had described, a rock where two roaring rivers of the underworld run together. Odysseus dug a trench there with his sword, a cubit long and a cubit wide, about the length of a forearm each way. Round it he poured the 3 libations for the dead, first honey mixed with milk, then sweet wine, then water, and scattered white barley meal over the whole of it, and made his prayers and his promises to the strengthless dead. Then he cut the throats of the black ram and the black ewe over the trench so that the blood ran down into it. The dead came up out of the gloom of Erebus in crowds, drawn to the blood. Brides who had died young, and boys, and old men worn thin by long grief, and girls with the sorrow still fresh on them, and ranks of men killed in battle still wearing their torn and bloodied armor. They pressed round the trench from every side, with a sound like a vast, inhuman crying, and Odysseus went pale with fear. His task there was ugly. Circe had told him that any ghost who drank the blood would recover memory and speech for a while, and that he must hold his drawn sword over the trench and let none of them drink before Tiresias. So he crouched at the edge of the world with a sword over a puddle of blood, rationing out short intervals of remembered life to a crowd of the dead. The first ghost was one he did not expect. Elpenor had reached Hades ahead of the ship, because a ghost travels faster than a galley. He did not need the blood to speak, being newly dead, and he asked for the only thing the dead can ask for. "Do not sail away and leave my body unwept and unburied at Circe's house," he said, "or the anger of the gods will come with you. Burn me with my armor, heap a mound over me by the gray sea, and plant on the mound the oar I pulled among my companions." Odysseus promised all of it. Then came his mother. Anticlea had been alive when he sailed for Troy. She sat now among the shadows on the far side of the trench, and he could not let her drink, because Tiresias had to drink first. So he held the sword between himself and his own mother, and made her wait, silent and not knowing him, and he stood at the edge of the blood and wept. Tiresias came at last, carrying his golden staff, and drank, and then set out the road. Poseidon hated him for the blinding of his son, and would make the way bitter, but he might still come home late and hard, on one condition, which was restraint. He would come to the island of Thrinacia, where the sun keeps his cattle. If he left those cattle alone, the whole company might yet reach Ithaca. If the cattle were harmed, the prophet foresaw destruction for the ship and for the crew. And if Odysseus himself survived that, he would come home late, broken, on a ship belonging to strangers, having lost every companion, to find arrogant men in his house eating his goods and courting his wife, and he would pay them back in blood. That is the curse from the clifftop, repeated word for word by an authority nobody could appeal against. Ratification, not prophecy. Tiresias then went past the end of this story into country the Odyssey never reaches. After the reckoning in the hall, he said, "Take up a well-made oar and walk inland, away from the sea, until you come to a people who know nothing of ships and have never eaten salt with their food. A traveler will meet you on that road and say that the thing on your shoulder is a winnowing fan, the flat wooden shovel a farmer uses to throw threshed grain into the wind, so the chaff blows away. When a man mistakes an oar for a farming tool, you have gone far enough. Plant the oar in the earth there, sacrifice to Poseidon, and go home." Death would come to him off the sea, or away from it, a phrase whose ambiguity was argued over for centuries, and it would be a gentle death in a sleek old age, with his people prosperous around him. Then Odysseus let his mother drink. She knew him at once, and asked how a living man had come to that place, and he asked her the questions he was afraid of, and she answered them. Laertes was alive, but in misery on the farm, sleeping by the fire in the ashes in winter, and on fallen leaves in the vineyard in summer, grieving. His son held his lands. His wife was still in his halls, faithful, and her nights were one long weeping. And she herself had not died of any sickness. She had died of missing him, she said, and it was longing for him that took the honey out of her life. 3 times Odysseus put out his arms to hold her, and 3 times she went through them like a shadow or a dream. When he cried out at it, she explained gently that this is what the dead are. The sinews no longer hold the flesh and the bone together, and the spirit goes out like a dream and flies away. After her came a procession. Persephone sent up the famous women of the old stories, queens and the mothers of heroes, each one drinking and telling her tale. Then came the men from Troy, and each reunion turned the knife. Agamemnon came weeping, and told what had been waiting for him at his own door, the welcome, the bath, the knife, and his wife's hand in it. His advice was bitter and practical. Trust no woman entirely, he said, and come into your own harbor secretly rather than openly. Your Penelope is not such a one, he added. Come secretly all the same. Achilles came, and Odysseus tried to comfort him. Do not grieve at being dead, he said. We honor you like a god when you were alive, and now you rule among the dead. The answer Achilles gave is one of the most quoted speeches in Greek literature, and it takes apart the value system he died for. Do not talk up death to me, he said. I would rather be the hired man of a landless farmer, alive on the earth, than king over all the perished dead. He brightened only once, when Odysseus told him that his son Neoptolemus had fought well at Troy, and then he went away across the fields of Asphodel, taking long strides, pleased about the boy. One ghost would not come. Great Ajax stood apart in silence, still angry about the armor of Achilles, which had been awarded to Odysseus, and had driven him to fall on his sword. Odysseus called to him with real remorse, and said he wished he had never won the prize, and asked him to speak. Ajax turned and walked away into the dark without a word. Further in, Odysseus saw the machinery of the place. Minos sat judging the dead with a golden scepter. Tantalus stood in a pool with water at his chin and fruit hanging above his head, and both the water and the fruit drew back from him whenever he moved. Sisyphus heaved his boulder up the hill, and the boulder rolled down again. The shade of Heracles came by, gloomy in the middle of his own glory, and recognized in Odysseus a fellow sufferer of impossible labors. Then the nations of the dead began to gather toward the blood, in numbers past counting, with that immense crying, and the nerve of Odysseus finally failed. He was afraid that Persephone might send up the head of the Gorgon out of the dark. He ran for the ship, and the crew got the oars out, and the current of ocean, and then a rising wind carried the living away from the country of the dead. They came back to Aiaia in darkness and slept on the beach, and at dawn they kept the promise made in Hades. They took Elpenor's body down, burned it with his armor, raised a mound over the ashes by the gray sea, and set his oar upright on top of it. Circe came down to the shore with bread and meat and wine, and greeted them with a line that manages to be warm and unnerving at once. Reckless men, she said, who have gone down alive into the house of Hades. Everyone else dies once. You will be twice dead. That night, while the crew slept, she took Odysseus aside and gave him something no one else on the voyage ever received, which was a briefing. Item by item, she described every danger on the road ahead, what it looked like, how it operated, and what to do about it. First the sirens, then a choice between 2 sea passages, then the island of the sun. She also told him where his own judgment would fail and what to do about that. At dawn they sailed, and the first item came quickly. The wind died to a flat calm, which Circe had predicted, because the sirens make their own weather. The sirens were two creatures sitting in a flowering meadow on an island, and their weapon was a song. Any sailor who heard it turned his ship toward the sound, and around the meadow lay the evidence, a heap of rotting men, with the skin shriveling on their bones. What the song offered was not pleasure. Circe was precise about this, and so are the sirens themselves. They sang knowledge. They knew everything that had happened at Troy, and they sang to Odysseus by name as he came level with them. And they said they knew everything that comes to pass on the fruitful earth, and invited him to come and sail on wiser than he came. For a man whose defining appetite was curiosity, it was the most personally aimed trap on the route. The defense Circe prescribed has become one of the most familiar images anywhere. Odysseus took a large wheel of beeswax, cut it into pieces with his sword, and worked the pieces soft in his hands and in the Mediterranean sun until the wax was pliable. Then he stopped the ears of every rower with it, so that the crew could hear nothing at all. Circe had told him that he alone might listen if he wanted to, and he wanted to. He had his men bind him upright against the mast, wrists and ankles, and gave a standing order. If he begged to be released, they were to tie him tighter. The ship went into the calm, rowing. The song came across the water, and it worked exactly as advertised, on a man who knew everything about it in advance. Odysseus strained against the ropes and signaled with his eyebrows to be cut loose, and ordered it, and begged for it. The system he had designed against his own future self held. Two of the crew, Paramedes and Eurylochus, got up and tightened the ropes as instructed. The ship passed, the song fell behind, the wax came out of the ears, the ropes came off. Philosophers and economists still use his name for that kind of arrangement, in which a person of sound mind restricts in advance what he will be allowed to do later under pressure. It appears now in medicine and in law under the name of a Ulysses contract, several thousand years after a sailor in a poem invented it with a rope. 6 men taken off the deck. Beyond the sirens, the sea began to smoke and thunder, and the crew heard it and dropped their oars in terror. Odysseus walked down the length of the ship, talking them back onto the benches. They had been in worse, he told them. This was no more terrible than the cave of the Cyclops. It was a carefully chosen truth. What he did not tell them, and he admits this outright, was what Circe had said about the passage ahead, because there was nothing they could do about it, and men cannot row in despair at the same time. The passage was a strait, and tradition has always placed it at the narrow, turbulent Strait of Messina between Italy and Sicily, which is plausible enough. On one side stood a low rock with a great fig tree growing out of it, and under that rock, 3 times a day, a whirlpool called Charybdis sucked the sea down entire, and 3 times a day vomited it back up. When she swallowed, whatever floated above her went down with the water and did not come back. No seamanship helped against her. She was a mouth in the ocean. On the other side rose a sheer cliff with its top permanently in cloud, and halfway up the cliff was a cave, and in the cave lived Scylla. Homer builds her carefully. "12 dangling legs, 6 necks of enormous length, and on each neck a head with 3 rows of packed teeth." She yelped in a small voice like a newborn puppy, which somehow makes the rest of it worse. She could not be fought, dodged, or outrun. From every ship that passed within reach, each of her 6 heads took 1 man. The choice Circe had described is the coldest piece of arithmetic in ancient literature. Steer wide of Scylla toward Charybdis, and risk losing the ship and everyone in it. Or hug Scylla's cliff and lose 6 men, not perhaps 6. 6. Odysseus had asked Circe, when she briefed him, whether he could not fight Scylla off somehow and lose nobody. Her answer was his whole life compressed into a sentence. "Stubborn man," she said, "always war and battle. Will you not give way even to the immortals? She is not mortal. She is an undying evil, and there is no defense against her. The only course is flight, and while you row, call on her mother to keep her from striking a second time." So he chose the 6, as any captain in that strait had to. Then he put on his armor anyway, and stood in the bow with 2 spears, watching the cliff, knowing it was useless, unable to be the kind of man who does not try. The ship went into the strait, hugging the rock. Every man aboard was staring at the other side, where Charybdis was in full swallow, the sea running down her throat with a roar, spray raining as high as the masthead, the black sand of the bottom showing at the center of the vortex. While they watched the whirlpool, Scylla took her toll from behind them. 6 heads came down, and 6 men went up. Odysseus turned at the cry and saw them lifted high over the deck, writhing, calling his name, stretching their hands down toward him, and there was nothing to be done but keep rowing. She ate them at the mouth of her cave, still reaching out to him. Of everything he suffered on all the seas, he said, that was the most pitiful sight his eyes ever saw. It is the one loss on the voyage that he selected in advance, with full knowledge, as the price of everybody else. The ship came out of the strait into open water with 39 men where 45 had been. Ahead, low and green, an island appeared, and from far out they could hear cattle lowing on it. The cattle that lowed on the spits. The island was Thrinacia, and the herds on it belonged to Helios, the sun, the god who sees everything that happens on the earth, because looking down at it is, in the plainest sense, his occupation. There were 7 herds of cattle and 7 flocks of sheep, 50 head in each, and the numbers never grew and never shrank. 2 nymphs, daughters of Helios, tended them. The livestock was immortal, sacred, inventoried, and under permanent aerial observation. Odysseus did not want to stop there. Standing off the coast, he repeated to the crew what Tiresias had said in Hades and what Circe had said on her beach, which agreed exactly, and gave the order to row past. For the first time on the voyage, the crew formally refused. Their spokesman was Eurylochus, and his speech is a mutiny conducted entirely in the language of reasonableness. "You are made of iron," he told Odysseus. "You are never tired, and we are exhausted men who have not slept. Night is coming, and night winds wreck ships, and you would have us row on into the dark past a safe beach. Let us land, cook a supper, sleep beside the ship, and sail at first light." The whole crew shouted agreement, and Odysseus understood that some god was arranging his ruin, because he had lost the argument before it started. He extracted the only concession available. Every man swore a solemn oath to touch nothing on the island, not one cow and not one sheep, and to eat only the provisions Circe had put aboard, and to leave at dawn. That night, while they slept on the sand, Zeus sent the storm. It blew out of the south, and then it did not stop. For 1 entire month, the south wind and the east wind took turns sealing the island shut, and no vessel of that age could beat out against them. The Greeks were pinned on Thrinacia. Day by day the provisions from Aia went down to crumbs, and then to nothing. The men spread out along the shore with hooks and snares, taking what fish and seabirds they could, and hunger of the real kind, the kind that hollows a face and takes a man's judgment apart, moved into the camp and settled in among the oaths. All around them, morning and evening, the fat, glossy, forbidden cattle grazed within a spear's throw of the beach, guarded by nothing but a promise. The trap was designed. Tiresias had said, "If you harm the cattle," and a prophecy of that kind does not sit and wait to see what happens. The month of contrary wind is the machinery by which the condition becomes the outcome. The gods of this poem do not push a man's hand. They arrange the circumstances in which a man's own nature will do the pushing, and then they wait. The crew that had opened the bag of winds out of hungry envy was now being starved next to an unguarded feast. Odysseus held them for the whole month, which is one of the underrated pieces of leadership in the epic. Then he made the mistake that had been waiting for him. He walked inland alone to a sheltered spot out of the wind to pray to the gods for a way off the island, and the gods answered by pouring sleep over his eyelids. The one man whose wakefulness was holding the line was switched off, gently, at the decisive moment, exactly as he had been switched off within sight of Ithaca. On the beach, Eurylochus saw his chance and made the speech of his life. "All deaths are hateful," he said, "but death by starvation is the most miserable of all. Let us drive off the best of these cattle and sacrifice them properly to the gods with all the rites, and let us vow that when we reach Ithaca, we will build Helios a rich temple in repayment. And if the sun is angry enough to sink our ship for it, then I would rather gulp the sea and die in one moment than waste away by inches on a desert island." It is a persuasive speech. It offers piety, restitution, and a preference for a quick death over a slow one, and every starving man on that beach voted for it with his feet. They cut out the finest cattle in the herd and killed them, and the sacrifice that followed went wrong in every physical detail. A proper Greek sacrifice required barley grains scattered over the victim's head, and wine poured out as a libation, and the thigh bones wrapped in fat and burned so that the smoke went up to the god, and the meat roasted afterwards for the men. The crew had no barley, so they used oak leaves stripped from a nearby tree. They had no wine, so they poured water. The forms of worship were carried out with the wrong materials, over stolen animals, to buy pardon for the theft that was still in progress. Then the world began to object. The flayed hides crawled along the ground. The meat on the spits, both the roasted and the raw, loud like cattle. The men ate anyway. They feasted on it for 6 days. Odysseus woke, smelled roasting fat on the wind, and knew what had happened before he reached the beach. His cry to the gods was the sound of a man at the end of a long rope. They had lulled him to sleep in order to ruin him. On Olympus, the accounting was already moving. The nymphs who kept the herds had gone to their father, and Helios stood in front of Zeus with a demand that shows precisely how much leverage the sun holds. "Punish the men who killed my cattle," he said, "or I will go down and shine among the dead instead, and light the underworld." Zeus, facing the prospect of the sun leaving the sky over a livestock dispute, gave his word. "Sail on, old friend. I will deal with the ship personally." On the 7th day, the wind dropped at last. The Greeks launched immediately and stood out to sea, and for a little while the island sank astern, and hope came back aboard. Then, when they were out of sight of all land, with nothing but water and sky in every direction, Zeus put a blue-black cloud directly over the ship, and the sea went dark underneath it. A screaming squall came out of the west and snapped both forestays, and the mast went over backwards, and its rigging came down into the bilge, and the falling spar caught the helmsman on the skull and dropped him dead over the side. Then Zeus threw the thunderbolt. It struck amidships. The ship spun, filled, and stank of sulfur, and every man aboard went into the water. Homer gives the crew their last image, bobbing around the black hull like seabirds on the swell, with the god taking away their homecoming until the sea collected them, one at a time. Of the 600 or so who had sailed from Troy, the count of the living now stood at 1. Odysseus survived by shipwright's reflex. He lashed the floating mast and the keel together with a leather backstay and rode the wreckage. Then the wind swung round into the south and delivered the last refinement of the punishment. It blew him backwards all night, straight up the coast, straight to the strait, straight to Charybdis, and he arrived exactly as she began her morning swallow. The whirlpool took the raft down. Odysseus jumped, caught the branches of the great fig tree that overhung the vortex, and hung there, clinging like a bat, with nothing under his feet but the spinning throat of the sea. He waited hours until the timbers of the raft shot back up out of the deep when Charybdis vomited the water out again, and then he dropped, hit the water beside them, climbed on, and paddled out of the strait with his hands. Scylla, on her cliff above, never saw him go. A god hid him from her, he said. For 9 days he drifted on the lashed spars across empty sea. On the 10th night, the gods put him ashore on a wooded island at the navel of the ocean, where a goddess lived alone. "7 years on Ogygia." Ogygia was a paradise by every account. There was a cave hung with vines heavy with grapes, and meadows of violets and wild parsley, and 4 springs of clear water running off in 4 directions from a single spot. Alders and poplars and sweet-smelling cypress grew round the cave, with birds nesting in them. Homer says that a god arriving there would stop and stare. Its only inhabitant was Calypso, a goddess, daughter of the Titan Atlas, living at the far edge of the sea alone with her loom and her garden. Her name comes from a Greek word meaning to cover or to conceal, and that is what she did with the man the sea delivered onto her beach. For 7 years, as far as the world was concerned, Odysseus had ceased to exist. What she offered him was the largest offer any mortal in Greek myth received. Not merely her bed, and not merely the island. She would make him deathless and ageless, her husband forever, in a garden at the end of the world. Every terror of the human condition canceled. The old age that was waiting for him canceled with it. All he had to do was stop wanting Ithaca. He said no. He did not say it once in a scene. He said it continuously and quietly for 7 years, in the only way available to a mortal with no ship, which was to remain in grief. The nights he spent in the goddess's bed, unwilling beside the willing, because she was a goddess and he was her guest and her prisoner, and the poem does not pretend a captive has clean choices. The days he spent alone on the headland, sitting on the rocks, looking east across the water, weeping. 7 years of that. The most resourceful man of the age was out of resources, with nothing left of his cleverness except the refusal to be consoled. Calypso eventually put the comparison to him directly and without malice. "If you knew," she said, "how much suffering is still waiting for you between here and your own country, you would stay here with me and be immortal. And besides," she added with an immortal's frankness, "I am surely not inferior to your wife in figure or in bearing, since mortal women cannot compete with goddesses in beauty." Every word of that was true, and Odysseus said so. "Goddess," he answered, "I know it, and it is all just as you say. Wise Penelope is less than you to look at because she is mortal and you are deathless and unaging. Even so, what I want every day is to go home and see the day of my return. And if some god wrecks me again on the wine-dark sea, I will bear it. I have suffered a great deal already. Let this be added to the rest. He conceded every point and chose Ithaca. He chose a mortal wife over an immortal lover, an old age over an eternal youth, and a difficult real life over a perfect suspended one. What the lotus had done from outside, by removing the wanting, 7 years of paradise could not do from inside. The rescue began, when it finally began, in a meeting. Poseidon was away at the edge of the world, feasting with the Ethiopians, and with him absent, Athena raised the case in front of Zeus and the assembled gods. Her speech was targeted indignation. "What is the point," she asked, "of a king being gentle and just, if this is what it earns him? Odysseus is rotting on an island, held by a nymph, weeping for a home he cannot reach. And his son is in danger now as well, because the suitors on Ithaca are planning to murder the boy at sea." Zeus agreed that the time had come. Hermes was sent across the water, skimming the waves like a seabird, to deliver the decision to Calypso. He found her at the loom, singing, with cedar and juniper burning on the hearth, and the scent of it carrying across the island, and Odysseus, as usual, down on the shore, crying. Over refreshments, because even a divine ultimatum observes hospitality, Hermes delivered the message. Zeus says the man must go. It is not fated that he die here. His destiny is to see his own people and his own house again. Calypso's reply, before she gave in, is the closest thing in Homer to a protest lodged against the management. You gods are jealous, she said, and merciless. You male gods take mortal women whenever you please, and when a goddess loves a mortal man, you begrudge it every time. She listed the precedents like a lawyer, naming goddesses whose mortal lovers the gods had struck down. And now you envy me this man, whom I saved when he was riding his keel alone in the sea after Zeus himself had smashed his ship. Very well, let him go if Zeus commands it. But I cannot send him. I have no ships and no crews. I can only give him advice, and I will hide nothing. She kept her word with a grace that redeems the whole 7 years. She went down to the shore, found him, and told him to stop grieving, because she was sending him home. His first reaction was pure Odysseus. He did not believe her. He refused to set foot on any raft until she swore the great oath of the gods that this was not some new trap. Calypso smiled and touched his cheek and called him incorrigible, and swore it by the water of Styx, which is the oath no god can break. That evening they dined together for the last time, she on ambrosia, and he on mortal food, and she made her final offer of immortality, and heard his final answer, and let it be. Then, for 4 days, the goddess and the man built a boat. She gave him a great bronze axe with an olive wood handle, and a smaller adze for finishing, and led him to the tallest trees at the far end of the island, alder and poplar and fir, long dead and dry, which is the wood that floats best. He felled 20 of them. He trimmed them, smoothed them, and lined them up true, then bored the timbers and joined them with pegs and mortises, so the whole hull was locked together without a nail. He laid a deck over the frame, stepped a mast with a yard across it, hung a steering oar at the stern to serve as a rudder, and fenced the sides with willow hurdles to keep the waves out. Calypso brought cloth for the sail, and he cut and rigged it, and fitted braces and halyards, and levered the finished craft down to the water on rollers. Homer, whose audience knew boats the way later audiences know cars, goes through every joint and plank of it. The last vessel Odysseus sailed was not given to him. He built it himself, plank by plank, a king working as a carpenter to earn his way back into the world. On the 5th day, she bathed him and dressed him in fragrant clothes and stocked the boat with water, wine, grain, and cooked meat, and sent a warm, following breeze after him. Then she stood on the shore of her hidden island and watched the raft get smaller. She had loved him for 7 years and released him in 4 days. And of all the beings who ever held Odysseus against his will, she is the only one the story allows a broken heart. He sailed alone for 17 days and never slept, steering by the stars she had named for him, keeping the great bear on his left hand the whole way, which is what a man must do to hold an easterly course in that sea. On the 18th day, a coastline came up ahead like a shield laid flat on the misty water. It was the land of the Phaeacians, his last stop before home, though he did not know that. At that moment Poseidon, coming back from Ethiopia, looked down from the mountains of a distant shore and saw, sailing calmly across his own sea, the one mortal he hated most in the world. Poseidon's first reaction was a growl of pure grievance. The gods had changed their minds about Odysseus while he was away at dinner. Very well. The man was fated to reach the Phaeacians, and that could not be prevented. But there was still time to give him his fill of trouble. Then the god of the sea took up his trident and went to work on the weather personally. What he assembled over that small raft was every storm at once. The east wind, the south wind, the west wind, and the north wind all came in together, driving the sea into confusion from four quarters, so that no wave ran in any direction a steersman could use. Odysseus felt his knees go loose, and said aloud the wish that shipwrecked men have said ever since, which was that he had died at Troy on dry land, with an army round him and a funeral afterwards, instead of alone out here to feed fish. A wave broke the steering oar out of his hands. The mast snapped. He went off the raft bodily, and his heavy sea clothes dragged him deep before he fought his way back up, spitting brine, and got a hand on the timbers again. Help arrived from an unexpected quarter. A white seabird settled on the wreck, and it was Ino, once a mortal woman and now a minor goddess of the waves, and she took pity on him. Her advice was drastic. "The raft is finished," she said. "Strip off those clothes, take my veil, wind it round your chest, and swim. It cannot let you sink. When you reach land, throw the veil back into the sea and look away as you do it." Odysseus, in the middle of a catastrophe, suspected a trap and decided to stay with the raft as long as two of its planks held together. Shortly afterwards, a comber the size of a hillside blew the timbers apart like chaff. He got astride a single beam, stripped, bound the veil round his ribs, and went into the water. He swam for 2 days and 2 nights in the swell, kept up by the veil and by Athena, who flattened the other winds and put a steady push behind him out of the north. When he finally raised the coast, it nearly killed him. There was no harbor on that stretch, only reefs and cliffs with the sea exploding white against them. His first attempt to land ended with a wave slamming him onto a rock face, where he clung with both hands until the backwash tore him off and dragged him out again, leaving the skin of his palms behind on the stone the way an octopus leaves pebbles stuck to its suckers when it is pulled out of its hole. Swimming along the coast outside the surf, he found a river mouth at last and prayed to the river god, and the river stilled its current and let him crawl ashore. The man who came out of that water owned nothing. He was naked, swollen with seawater, with brine running out of his mouth and nostrils, without ship, crew, clothes, or property of any kind. He kissed the ground, threw Ino's veil back into the waves as he had promised, and then solved the last problem of the day, which was that night was coming, and an exhausted, naked man dies of cold beside a river. He found 2 olive bushes grown together into one thicket, one of them wild and one of them cultivated, burrowed into the deep drift of dead leaves underneath, and covered himself over the way a farmer on a lonely holding banks a live coal under ashes to keep the fire until morning. Athena poured sleep over his eyes. Laundry at the river. The country was Scheria, land of the Phaeacians, and it was something new on that journey. There were no monsters in it, and no witches. The Phaeacians were a wealthy, civilized, faintly self-satisfied seafaring people, favored by the gods, whose ships were the morph of the world and were said to need no steersman, finding any port on earth by thought alone. Their king was Alcinous. Their queen was Arete, and she was honored in that court as fully as any man, which the poem notes as unusual. Their capital had harbors, temples, an assembly ground, and gardens that bore fruit in every season of the year. The introduction came through a teenager doing the washing. The Princess Nausicaa, prompted by a dream Athena sent her, had driven the palace laundry down to the river that morning in a mule cart with her maids. They trod the clothes clean in the washing pits, spread them on the shingle to dry, bathed, ate, and then played ball on the beach. A stray throw went into the river, and the shout the girls raised woke the man asleep under the olive bushes. What followed is the finest comedy of manners in Greek epic. Odysseus came out of the bushes naked, salt-crusted, and terrifying, holding a leafy branch in front of himself for decency, and every girl on that beach ran screaming, except one. Nausicaa stood still. The shipwrecked politician in front of her then produced, on no sleep and an empty stomach, one of the most skillful speeches of his life. He opened by asking whether she was a goddess or a mortal woman, compared her to Artemis, blessed the future husband who would win her, and asked for a rag to wear and directions to the town, all while keeping a careful distance, which under the circumstances was the persuasive part. It worked, as his speeches generally did. He was given clothes from the royal laundry, and bathed and oiled himself in the river, and Athena made him taller and more impressive for good measure, so that Nausicaa remarked to her maids that she would not mind a husband of that kind. She also gave him shrewd local advice. He was to come into the city separately from her party to avoid gossip in the harbor, and once inside the palace, he was to walk straight past the king and clasp the knees of Queen Arete, because her favor decided everything in that house. He did exactly that, walking in through the torchlit hall inside a mist Athena wrapped round him, and materializing at the queen's feet in front of the whole court. The Phaeacians received the nameless stranger by the book, food first, questions later. Odysseus stayed in that palace for several days as a guest of honor with no name, and the court entertained him. The blind court singer Demodocus performed for the property, and what he chose, out of every story in the world, was the Trojan War. He sang about a quarrel between Odysseus and Achilles, and the famous names of the men who fought there, and the anonymous guest at the feast pulled his cloak over his head and wept into it where nobody could see. It happened twice. The second time, at Odysseus's own request, the singer took up the story of the wooden horse and the sack of the city, and the guest came apart. Homer compares him to a woman weeping over the body of her husband, killed defending his own city while she watched. King Alcinous saw the weeping, stopped the music, and asked the question that had been politely postponed for days. "Stranger, who are you?" "I am Odysseus, son of Laertes," he said, "known among men for my schemes, and my fame reaches heaven, and my home is Ithaca." Then he told them everything, and his telling runs for 4 books of the poem. The Cicones, the lotus, the cave, the bag of winds, the giants at Telepolis, Circe, the trench at the edge of the world, the sirens, the strait, the cattle, Calypso, all of it. Everything of the wanderings comes to later listeners through that after-dinner account, delivered at a feast by the most accomplished liar in Greece. The Phaeacians did not merely believe him, they paid him. Alcinous called for gifts from every noble in the hall, bronze and gold and fine woven cloth, so that the man who had crawled ashore naked ended up with more treasure than his share of Troy's plunder had been, and that plunder was at the bottom of the sea with the ships. Then they made good on their reputation as the ferrymen of the world. A ship was launched, the gifts were stowed under the benches, and Odysseus made his farewells, in which Nausicaa asked only that he remember her, since she had saved him first. He lay down on a blanket spread on the deck. The ship ran west through the night, faster than a hawk, and sleep took him, deep and sweet, and, the poet says, very like death. He did not wake when it touched Ithaca. The Phaeacian crew carried the sleeping king ashore, laid him on the sand of his own island, stacked the treasure beside an olive tree, and rowed away. After 20 years, 10 of war and 10 of wandering, Odysseus arrived unconscious and missed it. Poseidon took his last toll, not from him, but from the men who had helped him. As the Phaeacian ship came into its home harbor with the whole city watching, the god struck it once with the flat of his hand and turned it to stone. It stood there in the water afterwards, a ship-shaped rock in sight of the town. Alcinous remembered an old prophecy that had warned of exactly this, and made a policy change on the spot regarding passages for strangers. Odysseus woke on the sand and did not know where he was. Athena had wrapped the coast in mist, partly for his protection, and he looked round at the harbor, the olive tree, and the hills he had grown up under, and groaned aloud that the Phaeacians had cheated him and dumped him in some other foreign country. Then he counted his treasure to see how much they had stolen, which was nothing. A young shepherd came through the mist, and Odysseus lied to him on reflex. Asked who he was, he improvised a complete biography on the spot: a fugitive from Crete, a killing over a share of plunder, a passage bought from Phoenician traders, one plausible detail after another. The shepherd heard the whole performance out and then changed shape. Athena's delight as she dropped the disguise is one of the warmest passages in the epic. "Anyone who could outdo you in trickery," she said, "would have to be a god. You incorrigible schemer, you will not stop lying even in your own country. This is why I cannot leave you alone. You and I are the same." Then she cleared the mist and showed him the harbor and the long ridge of the mountain above it. And Odysseus knelt down and kissed the ground of Ithaca. What followed was a council of war held between a goddess and a man crouched against the trunk of an olive tree. Athena told him the state of his own house, the 108 suitors in it, the pressure on his wife, and the ambush waiting at sea for his son. Between them, they settled the strategy that governs everything afterwards. There would be no open arrival. Agamemnon's ghost had given the warning in Hades, and here it became policy. Odysseus would enter his kingdom as an intelligence operation, establish who had stayed loyal across 20 years, and strike only when everything was in position. To make that possible, Athena withered the skin on his arms and legs, dimmed his eyes, took the brown hair off his head, and dressed him in a filthy tunic, a mangy deerskin, a beggar's staff, and a pouch on a string. The king of Ithaca became an old vagrant, which is a very effective disguise because it puts a man beneath the notice of everyone he passes. His first destination was not the palace. On Athena's instruction, he went up into the hills to a pig farm, and the man who ran it deserves his place in the story. Eumaeus the swineherd was a slave, and he had kept the absent king's herds honestly for 20 years, while the suitors ate them from the other end. When an anonymous old beggar appeared at his gate, Eumaeus beat off his own dogs to save him, brought him inside, killed 2 young pigs for him because that was the best he had, and explained himself in a sentence that has outlived the empires that came after him. "All strangers and beggars come from Zeus," he said, "and a gift, though small, is welcome." The disguised king stayed in that hut for days, testing the man from every angle and finding nothing but loyalty. Eumaeus spoke of his lost master with such grief that Odysseus, listening from inside the disguise, was hearing his own eulogy delivered by the one audience in the world that could not be performing for him. Eumaeus refused to believe any traveler's tale of the king's survival, because too many liars had come through that country already, trading on the queen's hope for a meal and a cloak. While his father was crossing the last of the sea, Telemachus had been abroad. Athena had prodded him into it at the very start of everything, and the trip turned into his education. He sailed first to sandy Pylos, where old Nestor received him with overwhelming hospitality, sacrifices on the beach, and a great many war stories, and could tell him nothing definite. He went on overland to Sparta, and there Menelaus and Helen, restored to each other and uneasily domestic, entertained him and told him about his father's exploits at Troy. Menelaus also had the one piece of hard intelligence in the entire Greek world. During his own long detour, he had cornered a shape-shifting sea god on the coast of Egypt and forced him to talk. And the god had said that Odysseus was alive and being held on an island by a nymph. The boy who had left Ithaca as a passive and hopeless teenager came back as something else, a young man who had sat at the tables of kings, been recognized on sight as his father's son, and learned how to speak in an assembly. That mattered immediately because the suitors had put a ship of armed men into the strait between the islands, with orders to kill him on the way home. Warned by Athena, Telemachus sailed a different course by night, landed on an outlying beach, and, as the goddess had arranged it, walked up to the hut of Eumaeus, while the swineherd and the old beggar were at breakfast. Eumaeus wept over him like a father over a son come back from the dead, which indicates plainly enough who had actually raised the boy. The swineherd was then sent down to the palace with a message for Penelope, and for the first time the beggar and the young man were alone. Athena appeared in the doorway, visible only to Odysseus, and touched him, and the disguise came off. The rags became clean clothes and the years dropped away, and Telemachus, seeing the transformation, concluded that he was in the presence of a god, and said so. "No god," said Odysseus. "I am your father, for whose sake you have grieved and suffered and endured the violence of men." Telemachus did not believe him at first. Then belief arrived all at once, and the two of them broke down together, crying, Homer says, more piercingly than eagles robbed of their young, and they would have wept until sunset if there had not been work to do. The reunion turned into a staff meeting within the hour. Odysseus laid out the arithmetic, which was 2 men against 108, and Telemachus, to his credit, said that the odds were insane. His father answered with the only allies that mattered, which were Athena and Zeus, and then set the plan. The beggar disguise would go back on. Telemachus would go home ahead and reveal nothing to anybody, including his mother. At a signal, on some ordinary evening, he would quietly take down the weapons that hung on the walls of the great hall and carry them into a storeroom and lock the door, leaving arms out for 2 men only. And whatever abuse the disguised king took in his own house, from whatever quarter, his son would swallow his anger and let it happen. The dog on the dung heap. The next morning, Telemachus went down to the palace and his anxious mother, and behind him along the mountain path came Eumaeus and a broken-down old beggar leaning on a stick. At the courtyard gate, they passed a rubbish heap, and something on it moved. It was a dog, old and dying, lying on the dung where the farmhands piled it before carting it out to the fields. He was too weak to get up, and he was crawling with vermin. His name was Argos. Odysseus had bred him and begun training him as a puppy 20 years earlier, and had sailed for Troy before ever taking him out. The young men of the household had hunted him in the old days after wild goats and hares, and then the years had passed and nobody bothered with him. As the beggar came up the path, the old dog knew him. Through the rags and the ruined skin and the 20 years, through a disguise woven by a goddess that fooled every human being in the palace from the queen downward, Argos knew his master. He had no strength to come any closer. He put his ears down and moved his tail. Odysseus could not react. One gesture toward that dog in front of Eumaeus, and the disguise was finished, and with it the plan and the lives of his family. He turned his face away and wiped off a tear where the swineherd could not see it, and asked, in a stranger's casual voice, whose dog that was lying there, and whether he had been any good in his day. "A fine dog once," Eumaeus said, "the fastest thing in the woods, before his master sailed away and died abroad. The women neglect him now." They walked on into the courtyard, and Argos, having seen Odysseus again in the 20th year, closed his eyes and died. The hall, the men in it, and the world it belonged to. The room Odysseus stepped into as a beggar was the center of his own house, and it is a room that can be reconstructed, because archaeologists have dug up palaces of that age at Mycenae, at Pylos, and at Tiryns. The centerpiece was always the same hall Homer describes, the Megaron. It was a long rectangle with a great round hearth burning in the middle of the floor, 4 columns standing round the hearth to hold the roof, an opening above to let the smoke out, and the king's seat against one wall. Benches for feasting ran down both sides. The walls were plastered and painted. The floor of that particular hall, on that particular evening, carried 108 uninvited men eating the owner's pigs. The society outside the door is worth walking through, because the poem is built out of its distinctions. At the top were the kings and the landed nobles, the basiles, men like Odysseus and like the fathers of the suitors. Their wealth was not counted in coin, which did not yet exist anywhere in that world. It was counted in land, in livestock, in bronze, and in stored treasure of the portable kind, tripods and cauldrons and fine cloth, given and received as gifts in a permanent circulation of obligation. Their days went in feasting, hunting, athletics, assembly, politics, and war. Their wives ran large, productive households and held the keys to the storeroom. A man of that class wore a tunic of fine wool or linen, with a heavy cloak pinned at the shoulder, and a woman of it wore layered, flounced skirts in bright dyed fabric with gold at the ears and wrists. Below them came the farmers and herdsmen, who worked their own plots, and the craftsmen, the smiths and potters and shipwrights. Then came a group the poem treats with particular respect, the traveling professionals. The seer, the healer, the carpenter, and the singer were welcome at any door in the country because their skills traveled with them and could not be taken away. Below these were the thetes, free men with no land, who hired themselves out for wages by the season, and whom the ghost of Achilles named as the lowest condition of free existence. Below the thetes were the slaves, most of them women taken in raids, who ground grain by hand every morning of their lives, wove, and carried water. A trusted few, like Eumaeus with his pigs, and the old nurse Euryclea in the house, ran their departments with real authority and were spoken of almost as family. Everyone in that world, at every level, lived on the same three things. Barley and wheat made bread and porridge. Wine was drunk always mixed with water, since drinking it neat was a mark of barbarians. Olive oil went into the food, and into the lamps, and onto the skin. Alongside those came figs, cheese, onions, and beans and lentils. The endless roast meat of Homer's feasts was the luxury of a great house, and even there it marked an occasion, because meat meant a sacrifice, and a sacrifice meant the gods took the smoke and the smell of the burning thigh bones while the mortals ate the rest. Into that hall, at the bottom of that order, walked its owner in the costume of the lowest thing a free man could be, and began begging from the men at his own tables. It was reconnaissance conducted as poverty. Going from man to man with his hand out, he was assessing each suitor in turn, and sorting the decent from the vicious, though the sorting changed nothing in the end. The suitors identified themselves for him. Their ringleader was Antinous, the most arrogant of the pack, and where the others tossed the old man scraps of bread and meat, Antinous picked up a footstool and threw it, hitting him at the base of the right shoulder. The hall went quiet, even by their standards. Striking a beggar was dangerous, and one of them said aloud why. Everyone knew that the gods walked the earth disguised as strangers and beggars, watching how men behaved. It is the single moment in which the suitors brush against the truth of their own situation, and then they went back to their wine. The house tested its master in other ways. A genuine beggar named Eris, the resident sponger of the palace, resented the competition and challenged the newcomer to a fist fight. The suitors were delighted and made a sport of it, putting up goat sausages from the evening supper as a prize. Odysseus stripped for the bout, revealing rather more thigh and shoulder than the rags had suggested. He hit Eris once, carefully, below the ear, and then dragged him out by the leg and propped him against the courtyard wall. The suitors laughed until they could not stand up and congratulated the old fellow warmly. Penelope came down into the hall that same evening. She had been holding a defensive action for 20 years with no relief in sight, and she chose that night to appear in front of the whole company and announce that the time of decision was approaching, and to observe that proper suitors bring gifts to a woman's house rather than eating it bare. The suitors scrambled to send servants home for robes, gold chains, and earrings. Odysseus, watching from his corner in the rags, was quietly delighted. Whether she sensed something that evening, or whether 20 years of marriage had simply taught him what her maneuvering looked like from the outside, the beggar in the corner recognized a fellow professional at work. Their interview came late that night, after the hall had emptied and the fire had burned down. The queen and the stranger sat facing each other, husband and wife, one of them aware of it. She asked who he was, and he gave her a Cretan story again, laced this time with truth. He claimed to have entertained Odysseus himself long ago, when weather forced his ships into a Cretan port on the way to Troy. To prove it, he described what the man had been wearing: a purple woolen cloak, doubled, and the golden brooch that fastened it, worked with the figure of a hound holding down a spotted fawn in its forepaws. Penelope had chosen that brooch and given it to her husband with her own hands. She wept at the description. Homer compares it to snow melting on the mountains in spring, when the meltwater runs down and the rivers fill. The man who had caused the tears was sitting beside her in a hall full of enemies, and could not comfort her, and he kept his eyes, the poem says, as hard as horn or iron behind their lids. He fed her hope in measured doses, swearing that Odysseus was alive, and close, and coming, before the year turned. She could not let herself take hold of it. Hope for this woman had become the enemy, the thing that had kept the wound open for 20 years. Then she did him a kindness that came very close to ending everything. She called for the old nurse to wash the honored stranger's feet, as a household did for a guest of rank, and the old nurse was Euryclea, who had taken Odysseus from his mother's arms on the day he was born. He saw the danger half a second too late. Above his knee ran a long scar, taken in boyhood on a hunting trip to Parnassus with his mother's family, when a boar came out of a thicket and drove its tusk into his leg before he killed it. Every servant of the old household knew that scar. He twisted round toward the shadows to keep it out of the firelight, but the old woman's hands found it under the water. She knew it, and she knew him, and her head came up, and her eyes went to Penelope's face, and her mouth opened to shout. Odysseus's hand closed on her throat. "Mother," he said, close to her ear, "you will destroy me. Not a word, or you die with the rest of them." The old woman, who was iron under the wrinkles, swore herself to silence, and finished washing the feet of the boy she had nursed, saying nothing, while the queen sat a few paces away wrapped in her own grief and noticed none of it, because Athena had turned her thoughts aside. Before they parted, Penelope told the stranger two things. The first was a dream. She had 20 geese in the yard, eating grain, and an eagle came down out of the mountains and broke their necks, and then the eagle spoke to her in her husband's voice. The beggar told her the dream needed no interpreter. The second was a decision. She could not hold out any longer, she said. The next day, she would set the suitors a contest, using her husband's own game. She would bring out his great bow and set up 12 axes in a line as he used to, and the man who could string the bow and send an arrow through all 12 would have her, and she would leave that house forever. The beggar leaned forward and told her to hold the contest without any delay at all. Odysseus of the many devices, he promised, would be in that hall before any of those men managed to string the bow. That night, the king lay sleepless on a bed of hides in the entryway of his own palace, listening to the giggling of the disloyal maidservants slipping out to the suitors' beds. His heart growled inside him, Homer says, the way a bitch stands over her puppies and growls at a stranger. He struck his own chest and spoke to his heart directly. Endure, heart. You endured worse than this the day the Cyclops ate your companions. And the heart obeyed and endured and lay still until morning. The bow and the 12 axes. The day of the contest was a feast day of Apollo, who is the archer god. Nobody in the hall found that ominous. The suitors came in as they always did, killed the animals as they always did, and settled to eat, and the omens began stacking up around them unremarked. There was a seer among the company, a man named Theoclymenus, whom Telemachus had brought home from the mainland. He looked at the laughing men and saw them as they were shortly going to be, wrapped in night, with the walls and the roof beams running blood, and the porch full of ghosts hurrying down into the dark. He said so out loud and left the building. The suitors laughed and suggested that somebody see the poor man out, since he apparently could not tell day from night. Penelope went up to the storeroom. She took the bent bronze key with the ivory handle, unlocked the door of the innermost chamber where the treasure was kept, and lifted down from its peg the great bow of Odysseus in its shining case. The bow had a history. It had been given to Odysseus in his youth by a friend named Iphitus when the two young men met in Messene on separate errands and exchanged gifts, and Iphitus was murdered soon afterwards by Heracles. Odysseus never took it to Troy. He kept it at home all those years in memory of the friendship and hunted with lesser bows. The queen sat down with the case across her knees, took out her husband's bow, and cried over it for a long time. Then she dried her face, went down into the hall full of feasting enemies, and announced the terms. Telemachus dug a long trench down the floor of the hall and set the 12 axes upright in a dead straight line, sighting along them, and tamped the earth in round them. He had never seen it done. He did it correctly at the first attempt, which surprised everyone present and possibly himself. The physics of what happened next is the whole point of the scene. The bow was a composite recurve, built up in laminated layers of wood, horn, and sinew, glued together and left to cure for a long time. Horn resists compression on the belly of the limb, sinew resists spreading on the back, and between them they store far more energy than a plain wooden stave of the same length. A bow of that construction, when it is unstrung, curls backwards against the direction it is drawn. To string it, a man must bend the entire stiff spring of the weapon the wrong way, past its natural set, and hold it bent while slipping the string loop over the notch at the tip. It is a matter of technique and body position rather than brute strength, and it cannot be improvised. A heavy war bow of that kind simply cannot be strung by an untrained man, whatever the size of his shoulders. The suitors were about to sit a public examination, set by an absent examiner, in a skill that none of them had. Whether Penelope understood that perfectly well is a question the poem leaves lying on the table. The first man to try was one of the more decent ones, and he could not move it. The bow wore out his hands, Homer says, as he worked it uselessly back and forth. Antinous, seeing a problem developing in front of the queen, called for a cake of tallow and a fire, and the suitors warmed the wood and greased it, and tried again in relays. One after another, the leading young men of Ithaca and the islands strained, sweated, and failed in front of the woman they intended to carry off. Eventually, Antinous surrendered to prudence and proposed adjourning the contest to another day, today being the feast of Apollo, and nobody being well advised to shoot arrows on the archer's own holiday. It was gracefully handled. It was also the last good idea of his life. While the nobility struggled with the bow, the beggar in the corner had gone out to run the last errand of a long game. He had followed two men into the courtyard whom he had spent days quietly assessing, Eumaeus the swineherd and Philoetius the cowherd, both of whom he had heard grieving for their lost master when they had no reason to perform. He put the question to them plainly. If Odysseus were to walk in here now, whose side would you take? Both answered without hesitating. Then look at me, said Odysseus, and pulled up his rags and showed them the scar. The two herdsmen wept over him and kissed his head and his shoulders until he had to quiet them, and then they took their orders. Eumaeus was to put the bow into the beggar's hands, whatever anybody shouted, and then go to the women's quarters and tell them to bolt the doors and stay inside no matter what they heard. Philoetius was to lock the courtyard gate and lash it shut with a ship's cable. The exits of the great hall of Odysseus were closing one at a time, while the men inside argued about archery. Back in the hall, the beggar spoke up and asked to try the bow himself, only to see whether there was any strength left in his arms. The suitors erupted. Antinous threatened him with mutilation. Penelope insisted that the stranger be given his turn, since he was a guest under that roof. Telemachus then did something he had never done. He overrode his mother in public, telling her that the bow was men's business, and his above all, since the authority in that house was his. Penelope, startled, obeyed him and went up the stairs to her room, where Athena poured sleep over her eyes, so that she slept through everything that came next. Eumaeus carried the great bow across the hall, through a gauntlet of shouting, and put it into the beggar's hands. The hall settled back, jeering, to watch the old man embarrass himself, and Homer gives the moment through their eyes. The beggar turned the bow over and over, this way and that, checking whether worms had got into the horn during its master's absence, taking his time, while the suitors made jokes about the old fellow being a connoisseur, or perhaps a dealer planning to set up in the trade. Then, the way a singer who knows his instrument stretches a new string round a peg without effort and without strain, Odysseus strung the great bow, in one motion. He plucked the string with his right hand to test it, and it sang under his finger like a swallow. The color went out of the suitors' faces. At that moment, Zeus thundered out of a clear sky, and the man on the stool smiled at the sound, because he had an arrow already in his hand. He did not stand up. He did not set his feet or take a stance. Sitting where he was, he laid the shaft across the bow, drew string and nock straight back, and sent the arrow through the helve sockets of all 12 axe heads, from the first to the last, without touching one of them. Then he spoke to his son. "The stranger has not disgraced you," he said. "My strength is unbroken, whatever these gentlemen thought of me. And now it is time to get supper ready for the Achaeans while there is still light, and afterwards there must be entertainment, with singing and the lyre, which are the crowning graces of a feast." 2 people in that room understood the sentence. Telemachus hung his sword at his side, took his spear in his fist, and came to stand beside the ragged man on the stool, armed and glittering. Odysseus stripped off the rags in one movement, and jumped up onto the great stone threshold at the head of the hall, which commanded the whole room and the only doorway, and poured the arrows out of the quiver at his feet. "That game is over," he said, "and now there is another target, one that no man has hit before." Every door was locked. The walls, thanks to a young man's quiet work with the armory, were bare of the shields and spears that had always hung on them. 108 men looked up from their tables at an archer standing between them and the way out. The hall with the doors shut. The first arrow went to Antinous. He was lifting a golden 2-handled cup to his lips, and death, Homer observes, was the last thing in his mind. Because who at a feast, among so many companions, expects one man to attack a crowd? The arrow went through his throat, the cup fell, and the wine went across the floor. The suitors sprang up in a roar and looked round the walls where the weapons had always hung, and found nothing there. They shouted at the beggar that he had killed the noblest young man in Ithaca by accident, and would pay for it with his life. They still believed it was an accident. Odysseus corrected them. "You dogs," he said. "You never thought I would come back from Troy. You wasted my house, you courted my wife while I was still living, and you feared neither the gods above nor any anger of men to come. Now the cords of destruction are fastened round every one of you." Their spokesman, a smooth man named Eurymachus, reached for the only 2 tools he had. He tried negotiation first, laying the whole affair on the conveniently dead Antinous, and offering full restitution, 20 oxen from every man present, and bronze and gold on top of it, until the king's heart was satisfied. Odysseus refused flatly. "Not if you handed over everything you have inherited," he said. "Would these hands stop before every trespass has been paid for?" Then Eurymachus drew his sword and called on the others to charge behind upended tables for shields, and got one step. The fight that followed filled the hall, and the poem does not hurry it. Odysseus shot from the threshold, man after man, while the arrows lasted. Telemachus ran to the storeroom for shields, helmets, and spears, and armed the 4 of them. The swineherd and the cowherd fought beside their master. There was one breach. A treacherous goatherd named Melanthius found a way up to the storeroom and began carrying arms down to the suitors, 12 shields and 12 spears, before he was caught in the act, bound hand and foot, and hauled up a pillar to hang there until there was time for him. There was also one intervention. Athena came into the hall, at first in the shape of an old friend of the family, and then she raised her aegis in the rafters above them, which is a storm shield that no mortal can look at, and the suitors stampeded down the length of the room like cattle scattering from a stinging fly in spring. The 4 hunters went after them, striking, and the floor ran and steamed with blood. Homer, who had already spent one whole epic watching men die at Troy, spares nothing here, and permits exactly 2 survivors. The singer Phemius, who had performed for the suitors under compulsion, was spared because a singer is a sacred person. The herald Medon, who had looked after Telemachus when he was small, was found hiding under an ox hide and hauled out shaking, and was spared as well. Everyone else in that hall died in it, all 106 of the rest. A priest among the suitors clasped the king's knees and begged, and was refused on the grounds that a chaplain to that company had certainly prayed for the king never to come home. When it was over, Odysseus stood among the bodies, spattered like a lion that has come from feeding, and the old nurse Euryclea started to raise a cry of triumph over the dead, and he stopped her. "It is unholy," he said, "to gloat over slain men. The gods and their own hard deeds destroyed these." Then came the grimmest housekeeping in ancient literature. 12 maidservants of the house had gone to the suitors' beds and carried information to them, and those 12 were made to carry the corpses out of the hall, sponge down the tables, and scrub the floor. When the room was clean, Telemachus had them hanged in the courtyard. Melanthius the goatherd was taken down from his pillar and butchered. The poem reports it without flinching and without apology. The hall was fumigated afterwards with burning sulfur, which was what a Greek house used to purify a room after a death, and the loyal women came out of their quarters with torches and wept over their master and took hold of his hands. The bed built round the tree. Euryclea climbed the stairs to the queen's chamber, cackling with the news she had been strangling for days. "Wake up, child," she said. "He is here. Odysseus is home, and the suitors are dead." Penelope did not believe her. She came down and sat across the hearth from the man everybody swore was her husband, and studied him in silence. One moment she recognized him, and the next she saw nothing but a stranger in bad clothes. Telemachus lost patience and scolded her, saying no other wife in the world would hold back from a husband 20 years gone. She answered that if this man was truly Odysseus, then the 2 of them had ways of knowing each other, signs between them that nobody else had ever been told. Odysseus, bathed now and dressed and made splendid by Athena, took his own turn at persuading her, and got nowhere. She had spent 20 years as the most courted woman in Greece, holding off professional liars, and she was not going to fail the last examination out of longing. So she set her trap as casually as her husband had ever set one. "Very well," she said to the nurse, in the hearing of the room. "Make up his bed for him outside the bridal chamber. Take the sturdy bedstead he built himself and move it out here, and put fleeces and blankets on it." Odysseus detonated. "What man has moved my bed? That bed cannot be moved." He had built it himself, he said, and he had built it round a living olive tree that grew in the courtyard, trimming the trunk from the root up, and squaring it and making it the bedpost, then raising the walls of the chamber round the tree, and roofing it over, and fitting the frame and inlaying it with gold and silver and ivory. No power short of a god could shift that bed without cutting through the tree. That is our sign, woman. Is the bed still rooted, or has somebody cut it loose? It was the password, and only the true man could have spoken it, and only by being provoked out of his cunning into honest outrage, which was the design. Her knees went loose where she sat. She ran to him and put her arms round his neck and kissed his face and asked him not to be angry with her. "Do not be hard on me for holding back," she said. I have been afraid all this time that some man would come and cheat me with a story. There are so many schemers in the world. Homer gives the homecoming its last image here. As welcome as land is to swimmers whose ship Poseidon has broken up at sea, and who strike out from the gray water toward the shore, so welcome to her was her husband, and she could not let her white arms go from his neck. The poem has spent its whole length wrecking this man at sea, and in the last embrace it makes Penelope the shore. Athena held back the dawn to give them the night, keeping the sun below the edge of the world, while the two of them lay and talked, telling each other 20 years, her weaving and her siege, his whole catalogue of wanderings. In the morning, Odysseus walked out to the farm in the hills and found his father digging round a young vine in the orchard, dressed in a patched tunic, with leather gaiters against the brambles and a goatskin cap. The son who had deceived everybody in the Mediterranean could not resist one last test, and questioned the old man as a stranger until his father's grief broke him open. Then Odysseus showed him the scar and named the trees, which was the better proof. Laertes had walked the orchard with him when he was a small boy and had given him trees of his own, 13 pear, 10 apple, 40 fig, and rows of vines that ripened in succession, and the boy had counted them and remembered them. The old man's knees gave way, and he fainted into his son's arms. The families of the dead suitors came out in arms for vengeance, as they were obliged to do, and the two sides met, and Laertes threw the first spear and killed a man. Then Athena, acting on instruction from Zeus, stopped the feud with a shout that dropped the weapons out of their hands, and imposed a peace on Ithaca with amnesty on both sides. The poem that opened on a house in chaos closes on an island at rest. Its hero's name entered 100 languages as a common noun for any long and difficult journey towards something that mattered. Sailors, soldiers, and emigrants carried the story with them. Poets from Virgil onward rewrote it, and philosophers argued with it, and the shape of it lies under a great many later tales about the long way home.